She's a nobody. Don't waste your time, my sister said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. Courtney said it with the same polished smile she had worn all afternoon, one hand resting lightly against the waist of her wedding gown, as though she were discussing the flowers instead of me. My fingers stopped around the stem of my water glass, and for one sharp second, every muscle in my jaw locked. Then her new husband looked across the ballroom, saw my face, and stopped walking. Blake Harrington came straight past his bride, crossed the space between us, and held out his hand. I had no idea she was your sister. He smiled at me. It's an honor to see you again. Before I tell you why those words wiped the smile off my sister's face, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me. Because what happened after that wedding taught me that sometimes the cruelest insult is really an attempt to keep you from noticing something much bigger. And if you enjoy family stories where the truth eventually catches up with the people who thought they could control it, subscribe to the channel and stay with me to the end. This happened last October, when I was 38. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and Courtney is 6 years younger than me. By the time she got married, we had already spent several years living the kind of sisterhood that looked respectable from a distance and required very little contact up close. We exchanged birthday messages. We showed up when our parents considered an occasion important enough. We did not borrow money from each other, share secrets, or pretend we were best friends. I had stopped trying to repair what Courtney preferred to perform. That was why I had gone to the wedding with a very simple plan. I would attend the ceremony, congratulate her, eat dinner, speak politely to our parents, and leave without giving anyone a story to tell about me afterward. I had skipped the engagement party, and most of the bridal events, which Courtney had presented to Blake as proof that I was distant and uninterested in family. She was not entirely wrong. I had simply learned that there was a difference between distance and peace, and I preferred the second one. The reception was held in a hotel ballroom outside Charlotte, the kind of place where the lighting made everyone look slightly more expensive than they really were. Blake's side included executives, hotel operators, venue owners, investors, and people who seemed to exchange business cards almost as often as they exchanged congratulations. Courtney loved that world. She had built sterling event staffing from a tiny operation into a regional company, supplying banquet servers, bartenders, hosts, and temporary event workers. And that night, she moved through the room like the wedding was also a product launch. I had been talking to a woman named Diane who managed events for several venues when she glanced past me toward Courtney. "Is that your sister?" she asked. I opened my mouth, but Courtney had already come close enough to hear. She laughed softly and said, "She's a nobody, don't waste your time." And 3 nearby tables went quiet enough that I heard a fork hit a plate. There had been a time when I would have confronted her immediately. Not because I was weak then, but because I used to believe every lie deserved an instant correction. By that point in my life, I had learned something more useful. People who insult you publicly are often hoping you will react publicly, because then they get to choose which part of the scene everyone remembers. Courtney wanted a wounded older sister. I decided she was not getting one, so I looked at Diane and finished the answer Courtney had interrupted. "Yes, I'm her sister." I took another sip of water and added, "And apparently tonight I've been promoted to nobody." Diane gave an uncomfortable little laugh, but Courtney's expression tightened because I had not raised my voice. She could not accuse me of making a scene when I had barely changed my tone. That was when Blake saw me. He had been moving between tables with one of his groomsmen when his eyes landed on my face. He slowed down, looked again, and I watched recognition arrive before I understood why. Then he excused himself, walked past Courtney, and came toward me. His hand was already extended when the memory finally caught up with me. "Sarah Mitchell," he said. I shook his hand. "Blake Harrington." He laughed once, clearly surprised. "I had no idea she was your sister." Then he glanced at Courtney before looking back at me. "It's an honor to see you again." Courtney stepped between us just enough to remind everyone she was the bride. "You two know each other?" she asked, but there was nothing casual about the way she said it. Her shoulders had gone rigid beneath the delicate fabric of her dress. I remember noticing that, before I understood why it mattered. Blake nodded. We met a couple of years ago. Courtney gave a quick little smile. Sarah helps people with forms at a nonprofit. That description was technically connected to reality in the same way saying a surgeon worked with sharp objects was technically connected to reality. I worked for a nonprofit labor clinic, where I handled worker intake and advocacy. My job was to listen to individual complaints, identify patterns, help workers understand available processes, and work alongside legal staff when something required formal action. It was not glamorous, and I had never needed it to be. Blake looked at Courtney, then back at me. That's not quite how I remember it. I almost smiled. It was one meeting. One memorable meeting, he said. Your team caught a wage pattern our vendor controls had missed. Courtney's eyes moved between us. At one of Blake's hotels? Several properties, he said. A subcontractor. That meeting had happened in the spring 2 years earlier, long before Blake meant anything to my family. A subcontractor serving several Harrington hospitality properties had accumulated wage complaints that looked small when viewed separately. One employee had missing prep time. Another had overtime that did not appear where expected. Another was told a problem would be corrected later. Individually, each complaint could be dismissed as administrative noise. Together, they formed a pattern. I had entered the conference room with our legal staff, worker representatives, vendor management people, and executives from Harrington Hospitality. Blake was there because the issue had reached enough properties that it could no longer be treated like one bad manager in one building. I was not the lawyer in the room, and I did not pretend to be. My role was to show what the workers had reported and explain why the pattern mattered. At one point, people began arguing over settlement language, liability, and who was responsible for which failure. I remember becoming frustrated because everyone had started discussing the problem as though the workers themselves were pieces of paperwork. Blake asked what outcome I was actually looking for. I told him, I don't care who wins the meeting. I care who gets paid on Friday. He had not liked everything I said that day. I had not expected him to. But Harrington Hospitality eventually tightened parts of its vendor controls, and I went back to my job. Blake and I did not exchange Christmas cards, become friends, or remain in regular contact. To me, he had been one executive in one difficult room. Apparently, I had been more memorable to him. That explained why he recognized my face at the wedding. It also explained why he had never connected me to Courtney before then. He had met me once in a room crowded with lawyers, advocates, vendor people, and executives, years before he started dating my sister. Courtney had told him she had an older sister named Sarah who worked at some nonprofit, and since we were not close, he had never met me at the engagement party or any of the bridal events I had skipped. There had never been a reason for him to imagine that the Sarah from his family life was the same woman he had once met across a conference table. What I did not understand was why Courtney suddenly looked frightened instead of merely embarrassed. Blake was pulled away a few minutes later by one of his relatives, and Courtney immediately touched my elbow. Her fingers were gentle enough for anyone watching. The pressure behind them was not. Come with me, she said. She led me toward a quieter hallway just outside the ballroom. The music softened behind the closed doors, and the moment we were alone, the wedding smile disappeared. You couldn't let me have one day. I stared at her. I was sitting at a table. You know what I mean. No, actually, I don't. I folded my arms. You called me a nobody in front of your guests, then your husband recognized me. Which part of that did I arrange? Her mouth tightened. You always do this. Do what? Turn everything into some speech about work and workers and how everyone else is doing something wrong. I didn't give a speech. You didn't have to. Blake practically gave one for you. That bothered me, not because it hurt, but because it did not answer the obvious question. Courtney had spent most of our adult lives enjoying any opportunity to make my career sound small. Normally, Blake learning that I had once challenged his company should have delighted her. She could have turned it into another joke about me being difficult. Instead, she wanted the subject dead. So I asked her the question I should have asked the moment she called me nobody. Why did it matter that Blake thought I was nobody? Courtney blinked. There it was. A tiny pause, probably less than a second. But I knew my sister well enough to recognize when she was choosing an answer instead of giving one. It doesn't, she said. Then why are we standing in a hallway arguing about it? Because you embarrass me. How? Because you walk around acting like none of this matters. She gestured toward the ballroom. Success, relationships, people knowing who you are. You act like you're above all of it. That was closer to something honest. Courtney had always believed attention was proof of value, and I had always thought attention was mostly noise. Looking back, that was one of my blind spots. I thought because I did not care about image could not hurt me. At the time, I only said, "If you wanted me invisible, you shouldn't have invited me." Her face changed again, but before she could answer, the ballroom doors opened, and Mom appeared. "There you are, Courtney. People are waiting for the cake." Courtney smoothed her expression almost instantly. "We're coming." Mom looked at me with the familiar suspicion of someone who assumed tension involving Courtney had probably been caused by me. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I said. Courtney hated that answer. I could tell because she smiled. I did not leave immediately. That would have given her another version of the story, one where jealous Sarah stormed out because the bride got attention. I stayed through the cake cutting, spoke politely to Blake's mother, congratulated my parents, and waited until leaving no longer looked like a reaction. There was a difference between refusing drama and allowing someone else to decide your movements, and I had learned it the hard way. Before I left, I crossed paths again with Diane, the venue manager I had been talking to before Courtney interrupted us. She seemed embarrassed about what had happened and tried to smooth it over. "Courtney talks about you more than you probably realize." I gave her a skeptical look. "That would surprise me. She always says you're the one who helped her get her workforce policies right when she was starting Sterling." That stopped me. I had helped Courtney once. Years earlier, when Sterling had around 7 workers, and Courtney was still running schedules from her laptop at our parents' dining room table. She had asked me to read an early employee handbook. I remembered cleaning up confusing wording and telling her the document was basic. I had never considered myself her advisor. "Years ago," I said, "when she had 7 people." Diane's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh." Before I could ask what Courtney had actually told her, someone called Diane back toward the ballroom. She apologized and hurried away, leaving me beside a floral arrangement with the first real sense that something about the evening did not fit together. On the drive home, I replayed Courtney's reaction more than her insult. The word "nobody" did not bother me nearly as much as the panic that had followed Blake's recognition. Courtney had spent years minimizing my work. That was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the possibility that she had been describing my work very differently when I was not in the room. I still did not call her. That mattered later. My old habit would have been to demand an explanation immediately. By then, I had learned not to announce what I suspected before I knew what I could prove. Courtney had already shown me that she cared deeply about controlling the version of events other people heard. I was not going to hand her advance notice of the questions forming in my head. The wedding was on a Saturday. I spent Sunday doing normal things. I bought groceries, answered a few work emails, cleaned my kitchen, and tried to convince myself that Diane's comment had probably referred to that old handbook, and nothing more. Monday morning proved otherwise. At 9:17, an email arrived from a vendor compliance address I did not recognize. It was polite, dry, and exactly the kind of message most people would delete after reading the first sentence. The sender explained that Sterling Event Staffing was undergoing final due diligence for a preferred vendor process and that my relationship to the company required verification. I read the next sentence once, then again, then a third time. "Please confirm whether you currently serve as an independent workforce compliance advisor to Sterling Event Staffing." I sat very still at my desk. I had never held that position. I had never agreed to hold that position. And until that Monday morning, I had no idea my sister had told anyone that I did. Courtney called me 3 times before 10 that Monday morning. The first call came 6 minutes after the vendor verification email landed in my inbox. The second came 20 minutes later. The third came while I was reading the message for the 4th time. making sure I had not somehow misunderstood the words in front of me. Between the calls, she sent 2 texts. The first said, "We need to talk about Saturday." The second was softer. "I don't want this stupid wedding thing to become a bigger problem between us." I looked at both messages and put my phone face down on my desk. I was not afraid to speak to my sister. I simply had no intention of asking a question before I knew exactly what I was asking about. The email from the vendor compliance team was short and professional. Sterling Event Staffing was under final review for a preferred vendor program, and my relationship with the company needed to be verified. The wording that bothered me was specific. They were not asking whether I knew Courtney. They were asking whether I currently served as an independent workforce compliance advisor to her company. I could have replied immediately with one word: no. Instead, I asked them to send me the exact page on which my name appeared, the surrounding context, and the specific statement they needed me to confirm. I also wrote that I did not authorize any representation of an ongoing professional relationship with Sterling, and wanted to make sure I understood precisely what had been submitted before providing a formal response. Then I waited. Courtney called again shortly before lunch. I let it go to voicemail. This time, she left one. Her voice had the careful calm she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "Sarah, I know you're upset about what happened at the wedding. I shouldn't have said what I said. Fine. I'm sorry. But Blake has been asking weird questions, and I really don't want this turning into some giant family drama. Call me." I listened twice, not because I enjoyed hearing her apologize, but because one phrase stood out. Blake had been asking questions. Courtney still had not mentioned the vendor review. Either she did not know the verification team had contacted me yet, or she knew and was hoping to steer our conversation somewhere safer before I saw the paperwork. I did not know which. That was another reason not to call. The file arrived just after 1 in the afternoon. The compliance analyst explained that she was sending only the pages relevant to verifying my professional relationship, not Sterling's complete submission. That was fine with me. I did not need Sterling's financial information, client references, pricing, or internal business records. I needed to see what my sister had said about me. The first page contained a section describing Sterling's workforce practices. Most of the language was exactly what I expected from Courtney. Clean sentences, reassuring phrases, words like accountability, employee support, operational integrity, and responsive management. Then, I reached a small section titled External Compliance Resources. My name was there, Sarah Mitchell. My employer was listed beneath it, along with a shortened version of my professional background. Below that were 5 words that changed the temperature in my body. Independent Workforce Compliance Advisor. I did not feel betrayed first. I felt precise. That distinction mattered. Anger came later. In that first moment, I was looking for mechanics. Had she forged my signature? No. Had she attached a consulting agreement? No. Had she claimed I was licensed as something I was not? Not exactly. The description of my work was flattering but generally recognizable. The problem was the relationship it created between me and Sterling. The page made it sound as though I currently advised the company on workforce compliance. I had never done that. There was another paragraph stating that Sterling's employment practices had benefited from external worker advocacy guidance during the company's development. That sentence was slippery enough to be almost true. I had helped Courtney once, years earlier, when Sterling was tiny. I had looked over an early handbook because she had asked her older sister for help making it readable. I had not audited payroll. I had not reviewed wage practices. I had not monitored compliance. I had certainly never agreed to serve as an outside advisor as the company grew. The cleverness of it made me angrier than a fake signature would have. A forged signature would have been obvious. Courtney had done something more characteristic. She had taken a small truth, polished it, stretched it, then placed it inside a larger story where anyone reading it would reach a conclusion she could later claim she had never stated outright. I downloaded the pages and saved them in a folder on my personal computer. Then I called her. She answered before the first ring had fully finished. Finally, I got an email from the vendor review team. Silence. There was the answer to one question. Then Courtney said, "Okay." They sent me the page with my name. Another pause. "Sarah, before you freak out, you did help me." "I'm not freaking out. You sound like you're about to. I'm asking you what you submitted." "I didn't submit anything false." I looked at the words on my screen. "You identified me as your independent workforce compliance advisor. That's a description." "No, Courtney, it's a role. You advised me on workforce policies. Once. You gave me guidance. 6 years ago. So now we're arguing over vocabulary? We're arguing over whether I currently work with your company. You don't have to make it sound criminal. I haven't called it criminal. Then what are you calling it?" "Not true." She exhaled hard enough that I heard it through the phone. "This is exactly why I didn't want Blake talking to you Saturday. Everything has to become some moral emergency with you." That sentence answered another question. "So that's why you called me nobody." "Oh, please. You were afraid he'd realize what I actually do. I was afraid you would do this." "This what?" "Take one stupid line in a vendor packet and act like I built my company on your name." I did not take the bait. "Who wrote the wording?" "Our team prepared the application." "Who decided to put my name in it?" "Sarah. It's a simple question. You helped me. Everyone in the family knows you helped me." "That isn't an answer." She changed direction. "Do you even understand what this opportunity means for Sterling? This could put us into properties we've spent years trying to reach." I stared at the page again. "Then you should have been even more careful about what you submitted. You always do this. You stand outside everything, then judge the people who actually build something." "I'm not judging your business. I'm asking why my name is inside it." "Because you were part of the foundation." The certainty in her voice almost made me laugh, except there was nothing funny about it. "I read a handbook at Mom and Dad's dining table." "You did more than read it." "Then remind me." "I don't have time for this." "You had time to put my biography in a vendor packet." She went quiet. I could hear movement in the background. A door closing. Then her voice lowered. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet." "Good." That one word came too fast. Courtney continued. "Just call me before you respond. Let's make sure we're saying the same thing." "We aren't saying the same thing." "Sarah, don't do something that hurts my company because you're mad about the wedding." I felt my anger settle into something colder. "If the truth hurts your company, that isn't something I created on Saturday." She hung up. For several minutes, I stayed at my desk without moving. Then I did something I should have done before calling her. I opened my personal archive and searched her company name, Sterling Event Staffing. Hundreds of results appeared. Most were ordinary family things. Courtney sending photos when she booked her first large event. Mom forwarding an article that mentioned Sterling. Dad asking whether I knew someone who could recommend payroll software. Then I narrowed the dates. Spring of 2019. 6 years earlier, Sterling was barely a company. Courtney had 7 people she called regularly when she booked events, and half her operation seemed to run through group texts. She was 25 and determined to prove everyone wrong about her. I was 32, still working long days at the clinic and carrying the older sister habit of assuming that if Courtney asked me for practical help, I should give it. I remembered the afternoon before I found the email. Courtney had spread papers across our parents' dining table while Dad watched a baseball game in the next room. Mom kept bringing us food neither of us had asked for. Courtney had a cheap laptop, a yellow legal pad filled with names and phone numbers, and the kind of nervous energy she used to have before confidence became part of her brand. "Read this," she had said, sliding the laptop toward me. I looked at the document. "What am I reading?" "My employee handbook." "You have employees now?" 7. 7 people need a handbook?" She rolled her eyes. "This is why I didn't want to ask you." I laughed and pulled the laptop closer. "I'm kidding. Show me." The document was rough. Some sentences sounded as though Courtney had copied them from different websites without noticing that the tone changed every few paragraphs. A section about scheduling contradicted another section 3 pages later. There were phrases I told her to remove because ordinary workers should not need a dictionary to understand when they were expected to arrive or how to report a problem. Courtney sat beside me with a pen, making notes. For once, we had been easy together. That memory was important because I did not want to rewrite the past, just because I knew how the future turned out. Courtney had been excited. I had been proud of her. She was not plotting to misuse my name while I sat there correcting awkward sentences. She was trying to build something, and I had wanted her to succeed. At one point, she asked, "Does this make me look legitimate?" I told her, "Having policies doesn't make you legitimate. Following them does." She threw a crumpled napkin at me. "You're impossible. And free. Exactly why I keep you around." We had both laughed. That was the part that hurt when I remembered it later. Not because I had sacrificed something enormous for Courtney. I had not. I spent an afternoon helping my younger sister with a basic document. I would have done the same thing for a friend. The betrayal came from what she eventually decided that afternoon entitled her to claim. I found the file first. The old handbook still sat in an email attachment under a subject line that made me smile despite myself. "Please save me from sounding stupid." Then, I found my reply. I had written that I cleaned up confusing wording and flagged several sections she needed to think through. I reminded her that I was not acting as her lawyer and had not reviewed payroll systems, classifications, wage practices, or the many other things a growing employer would eventually need to address. Then came the sentence I had forgotten. "This is fine as a basic starting point for 7 people, but if Sterling grows, have qualified employment counsel review everything again. Don't keep using this version as if it covers a bigger operation." I read it slowly. Then I opened the attachment metadata. The document Courtney was using in the vendor packet was not identical to my old version, but pieces of the language were clearly descended from it. She had been telling the truth in the smallest possible sense. I had contributed to an early document. What she had erased was the boundary around that contribution. I saved the old email separately. Then I searched for anything else I had sent Courtney around that time. I found a short training outline I had shared after she asked how to explain complaint reporting to her tiny staff. Again, it was basic. Who to contact. How to document a scheduling problem. Why managers should not punish someone for raising a concern. Nothing about it turned me into Sterling's advisor. But now I understood where some of the language in the vendor packet had come from. Courtney had not invented a professional connection out of nothing. She had preserved one long after it ended. That afternoon, I drafted my response to the verification team. I deleted the first version because it sounded angry. I deleted the second because it included conclusions I could not prove. On the third try, I wrote only what I knew. I stated that I did not currently serve and had never served as Sterling Event Staffing's independent workforce compliance advisor. I explained that in 2019, when the company had approximately 7 workers, I had informally reviewed the wording of a basic handbook as a favor to my sister. I had not been retained, compensated, or engaged to provide ongoing compliance oversight. I had not reviewed Sterling's current workforce practices. I had not reviewed its current payroll practices. I had not authorized my name or professional biography to be used in a way that suggested an ongoing advisory relationship. I attached the old email showing the scope of what I had done and the warning that Sterling should obtain qualified employment counsel as it grew. Then I requested that my name either be removed from the packet or accurately described. Before I pressed send, I sat with my hand on the mouse for a while. I understood that correcting the record could hurt Courtney's vendor application. I also understood that Courtney would describe that consequence as something I had done to her. For a few years, that possibility might have been enough to make me soften the wording, "call Dad first," or give Courtney another day to fix it quietly. I did none of those things. I sent the email. The response came the following morning. The analyst thanked me for the clarification and confirmed that the relevant portion of Sterling's review would be paused while the discrepancy was addressed. They did not accuse Courtney of fraud. They did not threaten her. They did not tell me what would happen next. That was appropriate. I was not entitled to Sterling's entire review, simply because my name had appeared in one section of it. Courtney, however, reacted as though I had personally closed her company. Her text arrived that afternoon. "You paused the contract." I replied. "I corrected my information. You know what this could cost me. I know what you submitted. A minute later she wrote, Dad was right, you can never let anything go. I almost answered. Then I stopped. Courtney wanted to turn a factual correction into a family argument because family arguments were easier to manipulate. Facts were harder. I put the phone away. The rest of the week passed quietly enough that I began to wonder whether the problem really would remain limited to the vendor application. My supervisor knew only that a family matter involving my professional identity had come up. I had not brought Sterling into our work systems. I had no reason to believe anyone at the clinic had any connection to Courtney's company. Then, late Friday morning, our front desk coordinator appeared at my office door. There's a woman asking for you by name, she said. I looked up from my computer. Do I have an appointment? No. Walk in. She says it's about an employer. That was ordinary. Most of our work began with people who did not know exactly whom they needed to speak to. I picked up my notebook and walked to one of the small intake rooms. The woman waiting there was probably in her 40s. She wore black work pants, sensible shoes, and a dark blouse with faint creases at the sleeves, as though she had folded it into a bag before coming. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and there was a tiredness around her eyes that I recognized from years of listening to people explain problems they had already tried to solve alone. She stood when I entered. Sarah Mitchell? Yes. My name is Alina Ruse. I shook her hand and sat across from her. What can we help you with? She hesitated. I was told you know about worker pay policies. I work in worker advocacy. Tell me what brought you in and we'll figure out who should handle it. I worked banquets. 3 years, same company. I opened my notebook. Elena continued. They started cutting my better shifts after I kept asking about hours that weren't showing up right. I stopped writing. Which company? Sterling Event Staffing. My pen remained above the page. For 1 second, my mind tried to move ahead of procedure. Prep time. Missing hours. Better shifts disappearing. Courtney. The vendor packet. My name. I put the pen down. Elena, I need to stop you for a moment. Her expression changed immediately, suspicion replacing nervousness. Why? The owner of Sterling is my sister. She stared at me. I didn't know that. I believe you. But because of that relationship, I can't handle the substance of your case. I'm going to bring in my supervisor and another advocate so you can speak freely to someone who has no family connection to Sterling. Elena looked frustrated. But I came here because of you. That sentence landed harder than I expected. Why me? She glanced toward the closed door before looking back at me. Because when some of us asked questions about the pay policy, we were told not to worry. They said someone from a worker rights organization had already reviewed it. My stomach tightened. I kept my voice even. Did they give you a name? Elena nodded. Yours. I stood and went to the door. I'm getting someone else now. I don't want you telling me anything more until they're here. She looked confused. Am I getting you in trouble? No, you're doing exactly what you should be doing. I brought my supervisor and another advocate into the room. In front of Elena, I explained the conflict clearly. Sterling belonged to my sister. I had no current professional relationship with the company. I would not participate in Elena's substantive intake or any case that followed from it. My supervisor agreed and took over. I should have left immediately, but before I reached the door, Elena spoke again. Can I ask one thing? I turned. Her face had changed. She was no longer looking at me like a professional she had come to find. She was looking at me like someone who had just realized she might have been used in a story I did not know existed. If you weren't reviewing anything for them, she said, then why did they use your name? I did not have an answer. And for the first time since the wedding, I understood that Courtney might not have borrowed my reputation just to impress a vendor. Elena's question stayed with me after I left the intake room. But I did not answer it because I did not have an answer I could defend. I had already told my supervisor that Sterling belonged to my sister, and once that conflict was clear, the only responsible thing I could do was step away. My colleague Marcus took my seat beside Elena while my supervisor remained in the room to explain the handoff. I stood near the door long enough to make sure Elena understood that I was not refusing to help her personally. I was protecting her case from becoming tangled with my family. You came here for someone who can look at what happened to you without another loyalty in the room, I told her. That can't be me now that I know the company involved. Elena frowned, still disappointed, but she nodded. Before I left, she looked at Marcus and then back at me. Can I say one thing I already told her? She asked my supervisor. My supervisor agreed because the conflict had been disclosed, and the purpose was only to document why Elena had specifically requested me. Elena folded her hands on the table. She told us that Sterling workers had been shown training material and reminded more than once that the company's policies had outside guidance from someone who understood worker rights. She could not remember the exact wording from every meeting, and nobody in that room pushed her to reconstruct it. What she did remember was my name. She had heard Sarah Mitchell connected to the idea that Sterling's pay and scheduling practices had been reviewed by someone outside the company. That was why she had searched for me. Elena was not dramatic when she spoke. That made her harder to dismiss. She had worked banquet events for Sterling for almost 3 years and had become one of the people new workers were told to follow because she knew how venues operated. She described arriving before guests, checking assigned stations, helping inexperienced servers understand layouts, and staying late when an event ran long. Then she mentioned the thing that had finally made her start asking questions. Sometimes the time she spent preparing before the official start of a shift did not seem to match what later appeared on her paycheck. On other occasions, overtime hours appeared later than she expected. She said she had raised those concerns more than once, and after she kept asking, some of the premium hotel assignments she usually received began going to other people. I wanted to ask how many times. I wanted to ask who had spoken to her. I wanted to ask whether she had screenshots, pay stubs, schedule notices, or texts. Those questions formed automatically because that was how I worked, but I did not ask any of them. Marcus was sitting there precisely because I could not be the one to build that record. I told Elena, from this point forward, talk to Marcus the way you would have talked to me. Give him what you have, not what you think anyone wants to hear. Then I stepped out and closed the door behind me. Walking back to my office was one of the strangest experiences of my career. I had spent years telling workers that conflicts mattered, documentation mattered, boundaries mattered. Now, every instinct in me wanted to know what was happening inside that room, and the rules I believed in required me not to know. I could not use my access at the clinic to find out whether Elena had documents. I could not open her intake notes later. I could not ask Marcus how strong he thought the case was over coffee. The fact that my sister owned Sterling did not give me more rights. It gave me fewer. That distinction became important almost immediately. The following week, our clinic's legal staff took the next procedural steps with Elena's matter. I was not part of them. I did not draft the correspondence, approve it, or see the contents. What I learned came from Courtney herself on Tuesday afternoon, when she called me so furious that she forgot to pretend we were discussing a misunderstanding. Your office sent Sterling a preservation letter. I leaned back in my chair. Then someone there must be representing a worker. You know exactly who. I know a woman came to the clinic. I recused before her substantive intake. Courtney laughed sharply. That is such a convenient sentence. It's also true. Do you seriously expect me to believe she randomly walked into your workplace days after you tried to sabotage my vendor application? I didn't try to sabotage your application. You froze it. I corrected my name. And then suddenly, one of my former workers appears at your clinic. The accusation did not surprise me. What surprised me was how quickly Courtney assumed I would use professional access the way she had used my reputation. In her version of the world, if I had a system available to me, of course I would bend it toward a personal fight. She could not imagine why I would choose not to. You received something from the clinic because the clinic is handling whatever matter that worker brought in, I said. I am not handling it. Did you send her there? No. Did you tell her what to say? No. Did you tell your people to go after me? No. Courtney went quiet for a moment. You expect me to trust you? I almost reminded her who had placed whose name in a vendor packet without permission. Instead, I said, You don't need to trust me. There is a record of my recusal. That landed differently. Courtney had expected emotion. I gave her procedure. She changed tactics. Do Mom and Dad know what you're doing? I'm working. I mean to me. There is no to you from me. Your vendor application used my name. I corrected that. A worker came to my employer. I stepped away. You love saying things like that. It makes you sound clean. I am trying to keep this clean. You always have to be better than everybody. There it was again. Not the business argument. The family one. I ended the call because there was nowhere useful for it to go. If you have questions about the clinic correspondence, use the contact information on the letter. Do not call me about the worker matter again. You don't get to tell me what I can call you about. I get to decide what I will discuss. Then I hung up. The next few days taught me something uncomfortable about myself. I had always thought of Courtney's obsession with image as shallow. She liked polished branding, expensive rooms, the right names in the right photographs, and the feeling of being recognized when she walked into a venue. I had spent years assuming that because I did not value those things, they did not have much power. Now I was beginning to understand that Courtney had built an entire operating system out of perception. She knew what other people needed to see before they trusted her. She knew which words made a young staffing company sound established, and which associations made a company sound safe. My name had been one of those associations. Because I could not touch Elena's case, I went back through only what belonged to me. My own email archive. Files Courtney had sent me personally over the years. Family group messages. Public Sterling material anyone could see. I was careful about that boundary because I knew how easy it would be to tell myself I deserved more information. I did not. The old 2019 handbook had already shown me the first step. I had helped Courtney clean up basic language when Sterling had 7 workers. The email I sent afterward had explicitly told her that if the company grew, she needed qualified employment counsel and should not keep using that early version as though it covered a larger operation. That was clear. Then I found something I had forgotten. About a month after the handbook, Courtney had asked me for a simple training outline explaining how small employers should communicate complaint reporting to staff. I had sent her 4 slides. They were not legal advice. They were the kind of material I used all the time when speaking to community groups. Tell workers who receives complaints, keep the reporting process clear, document concerns, do not retaliate against someone merely for raising a pay or scheduling question. Years later, Courtney had sent our family group chat a screenshot from a Sterling presentation because she was proud that the company had started doing formal onboarding sessions. At the time, I barely looked at it. Now I opened the image. One of my old slides was on the screen behind Courtney. The formatting had changed. Sterling's logo sat in the corner. The wording had been trimmed, but the structure was mine. I stared at the screenshot longer than I should have. It did not prove anything about Elena's wages. It did not prove Courtney had violated a law. It did not prove retaliation. I kept reminding myself of that because anger makes people sloppy, and I refused to become sloppy just because my sister had been. What it did prove was that the borrowing had continued. Courtney had taken something I gave her when her company could fit around our parents' dining table and carried pieces of it forward as Sterling grew. Somewhere along the way, my sister helped me when I started, had become Outside Worker Rights Guidance. Then, Outside Worker Rights Guidance had become Independent Workforce Compliance Advisor. It was not one lie created in one afternoon. It was a staircase. That realization bothered me more than if Courtney had simply fabricated everything in September. My phone buzzed while the old screenshot was still open. The message was from Blake. For several seconds, I considered ignoring it. I did not want the bizarre shape of this story to turn into secret conversations between me and my sister's husband. That would give Courtney exactly the kind of narrative she preferred, one where the real issue disappeared under something more emotional. Blake's message was short. He said procurement had informed him only that a discrepancy had surfaced in Sterling's vendor review. Because he had formally recused himself from the scoring and compliance process after he and Courtney became engaged, he did not know the details and did not intend to ask for them. Then he added that he wanted to apologize for what happened at the wedding. He had not understood there was tension between Courtney and me until that night, and he was sorry his recognition of me had made an already uncomfortable situation worse. I read the message twice before replying. You didn't create the situation, and staying recused is the right thing to do. He responded a few minutes later. Understood. I won't ask what the discrepancy is. That should have ended the conversation, but another message appeared. For what it's worth, I really did not know you were her sister. Courtney always described your work very differently. I knew better than to ask how. Instead, I wrote, "Then you should talk to your wife about that." Blake replied, "I will." I put the phone away. I did not tell him about Elena. I did not tell him Courtney had used my biography. I did not send him the vendor page. If his company's procurement process needed to address those things, it had its own people. Blake being CEO did not make him an acceptable shortcut around the process. If anything, his relationship with Courtney made that more important. Later, I was grateful for that restraint. At the time, I simply wanted as few people as possible to be able to say I had used Courtney's marriage against her. Courtney tried another approach that evening. She sent me a text asking whether I could meet her for coffee. No accusations, no mention of Elena. She wrote, "I want to fix the part involving your name. Just us, no parents." That was the first reasonable thing she had said in days, so I agreed to meet her the following afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. Courtney arrived 10 minutes early. That alone told me how seriously she was taking the conversation. My sister was early only for flights, client pitches, and things she was afraid of losing. She had no makeup on except mascara and looked exhausted. For a moment, seeing her sitting there with both hands wrapped around a paper cup reminded me of the 25-year-old version of Courtney who had asked me whether her first employee handbook made her look legitimate. Then she opened a folder. I had counsel draft something. My stomach tightened at the word counsel, but I took the paper when she slid it across the table. The title called it A Clarification of Historical Advisory Support. I read the first paragraph. It stated that I had provided informal workforce guidance to Sterling during its development. That alone was broad, but arguable. The second paragraph went further. It said I had periodically consulted with Courtney on employee communication, complaint handling, and workforce practices over the years. I looked up. "No, you haven't even finished." "I don't need to. Sarah." It says informal. It says ongoing. It says periodic. That means more than once. You sent me documents more than once. In 2019. You've answered questions since then. Family questions. That's still guidance. I put the document flat on the table. Give me an example from the last 5 years where Sterling retained me, or asked me to review a current policy. Courtney's face tightened. Why does everything have to be a deposition with you? Because you're asking me to sign something. You're not signing a murder confession. You're confirming that you helped me. I already confirmed that I helped you in 2019. This clears up the confusion. No. It changes the history so your packet looks less wrong. Courtney leaned back. You really think I woke up one morning and decided to steal your identity? I think you used my professional name in a way I never approved. I used something that was true. Part of it was true. Exactly. That isn't helping your argument. Her fingers tightened around her cup. Do you understand what is happening to Sterling right now? The Harrington opportunity is on hold. Now I have a worker bringing complaints through your clinic. Clients are going to hear there's a review. People get nervous. They stop booking. That is how a company dies. I kept my voice calm. Then correct what's wrong. That is what I am trying to do. No, you're trying to make the old wording defensible, because it was defensible. If it was, you wouldn't need my signature now. That stopped her. For a second, neither of us spoke. I looked down at the document again. There was a place for my signature at the bottom, but no one had filled in a date. Why isn't this dated? I asked. Courtney frowned. It will be dated when you sign it. Good. What does that mean? It means at least nobody is pretending I signed it before the vendor packet. Her expression flashed with irritation. Nobody is pretending anything. I slid the document back toward her. Then remove my name from the packet and send a correction. We can do that after this. No, Sarah, I am not creating a retroactive advisory relationship so you can call the original statement a misunderstanding. You are unbelievable. I am being very clear. Courtney pushed the document back across the table. Read the whole thing. I did. No, you decided what it meant before you finished. I know what periodic consultation means. She lowered her voice. I can have them narrow it. You can narrow it to 2019. One handbook, one training outline, informal help, no current review, no ongoing compliance role. And make me look like I lied. I held her gaze. I'm not responsible for how the truth makes you look. Her face went pale, then angry. You have no idea what it took to build Sterling. You're right, I don't run your company. But you love judging it. This is not about how you run Sterling. It is now. You corrected that packet. Your office is sending letters. Blake is asking questions. Do you honestly think these things are separate? They are separate because I am keeping them separate. Courtney laughed, but there was no humor in it. Nobody keeps things separate like that. I do. That's because you never risk anything. The insult was familiar, but this time I heard what lived underneath it. Courtney believed I had nothing at stake because I did not own a company, host expensive events, or build a life around people watching me succeed. She mistook a quieter life for an empty one. I risk my name every time I put it on something, I said. That's why I'm careful where it goes. Her eyes shifted toward the paper. That was the moment I knew she understood. Not agreed. Understood. Courtney knew why I would not sign. She simply believed Sterling mattered more. We left the coffee shop without resolving anything. I took a photograph of the document before returning it to her, because it had been presented directly to me and involved my own professional representation. Courtney did not object. She was too busy telling me I was making a catastrophic mistake. That evening, she emailed me a PDF copy anyway. The message above it said, "Please reconsider before this gets worse." I saved both the email and attachment. Then I did nothing else. I did not forward the document to Elena's team. I did not send it to Blake. I did not call our parents. I did not post anything online. The document concerned what Courtney wanted me to say about my own relationship with Sterling. That was enough. The next morning, another email arrived from Courtney. This one was shorter. I talked to counsel. We can revise the language. You sign the clarification. We remove you from all future materials. And everyone moves on. I read it twice. There was the transaction in plain English. My consent, purchased after the fact, in exchange for ending the unauthorized use of my own name. I called Courtney because I wanted to hear her say it directly. She answered with irritation already in her voice. Did you read my email? Yes. Then you understand. I want you to say exactly what you're asking. She sighed. I'm asking you to confirm that you gave Sterling informal guidance over time. I didn't. You helped me. In 2019, we have been over this. Yes, we have. Her voice hardened. Sarah, I am trying to give you what you want. Your name comes off everything going forward. No more references, no more bio, nothing. And in exchange, you sign the clarification. I stood by my kitchen window, looking down at the quiet row of parked cars outside my townhouse. For years, I had thought Courtney's biggest weakness was vanity. By then, I understood it was something more dangerous. She needed the story she had already told to remain intact, even if reality had to be adjusted afterward to fit it. Then she said the sentence that removed the last bit of doubt. Sign this and I'll take your name off everything. I looked at the unsigned declaration on my screen and finally understood what she was offering me. Courtney was not asking me to correct a mistake. She was asking me to convert an old lie into a new half-truth. And she expected me to be grateful for the privilege. The morning after Courtney offered to remove my name from everything in exchange for my signature, I answered her in writing. I kept the email short because I had finally understood that every extra sentence gave her another phrase to reinterpret. I wrote that I could not confirm ongoing or periodic guidance because no such relationship had existed. I repeated that my informal help had been limited to a handbook and a basic training outline in 2019, when Sterling had roughly 7 workers. I asked that the current vendor packet be corrected. that my name and professional biography be removed from any material suggesting an ongoing advisory relationship, and that my written refusal be preserved with the rest of the correspondence. I added one paragraph because the distinction mattered. Any questions involving worker compensation, scheduling, retaliation, or other employment practices had to be handled through whatever independent legal or review process was already underway. I was not representing Sterling, Courtney, Elena, or any other worker. I would not negotiate those issues for anyone. My only demand concerned the thing I actually controlled, whether my name could be used to create credibility for a company I had not reviewed. Courtney did not reply that day. Moan did. Her text arrived the following evening. Thanksgiving at 3. Both of you are coming. We are not letting paperwork destroy this family. I stared at the message longer than it deserved. My mother had a talent for describing the reaction to a problem as though it were the problem itself. Courtney had used my professional identity without permission, but somehow paperwork was now the aggressor. I considered declining the invitation. I had no appetite for sitting across from Courtney while Mom passed mashed potatoes and pretended tension could be dissolved with gravy. Then Dad called. Your mother wants one normal holiday, he said. Normal according to who? He sighed. Sarah. I'm asking. We're all upset. Courtney's upset. You're upset. This business thing is getting bigger than anybody intended. There was something in the way he said business thing that caught my attention. Dad had always followed Sterling closely, but until then I had assumed it was the ordinary interest of a retired father who was proud of his younger daughter. He sometimes helped Courtney with bookkeeping. He talked about her bookings. He knew when she landed a new venue. None of that had seemed unusual. I'm not discussing Elena or anything from the clinic, I told him. I'm not asking you to. I'm also not signing Courtney's statement. Can we at least talk before everybody decides what they won't do? I almost said there was nothing left to discuss. Instead, I told him I would come with one condition. If anyone insulted me, pressured me to sign something, or tried to make me responsible for keeping Sterling alive, I would leave. I would not shout. I would not argue about whether leaving ruined Thanksgiving. I would simply get my coat and go. Dad was quiet for a moment. Fair enough. I did not believe Mom would consider it fair, but that was not the same thing. Thanksgiving afternoon was cold and gray, the kind of North Carolina day that could not decide whether it wanted to feel like autumn or winter. I drove to my parents' house with a pie on the passenger seat and no intention of staying past dessert if the conversation went where I expected it to go. Their house looked exactly as it had for years. Dad had already hung the same wooden turkey decoration near the front door. Mom had set the dining table with the china she used twice a year and complained about washing afterward. If you had looked through the window, you would have seen the picture she wanted us to be. Courtney arrived 20 minutes after I did. She came alone. Blake had gone to spend part of the day with his mother and siblings before joining Courtney later, or at least that was what Mom told me. I did not ask whether the arrangement was normal for newlyweds. Courtney and I had barely spoken since the coffee shop, and I was not going to use her marriage as a side door into a business dispute. For the first hour, everyone behaved. Mom asked about work without using the phrase, your little nonprofit. Dad talked about a neighbor replacing his roof. Courtney complimented the pie. I asked about her honeymoon, and she told me they had postponed the longer trip because her company was busy going into the holiday season. We were all so polite that the politeness itself became exhausting. The first crack appeared when Mom carried the turkey to the table and said, I want one meal where nobody talks about lawyers, reviews, or contracts. Courtney looked at me. Fine with me. I put green beans on my plate. Also fine with me. Dad tried to talk about football. It lasted about 6 minutes. Then Courtney said, I just wish everyone understood that real people are going to be affected by this. I set down my fork. Mom closed her eyes briefly. Courtney, no, Mom, I'm not fighting. I'm saying something true. Courtney looked across the table at me. Sterling employs more than 100 people during busy periods. These aren't numbers on a form. They have rent, kids, bills. I waited before answering because she had chosen the one argument guaranteed to make me sound cruel if I reacted carelessly. I know workers have bills, I said. That's my job. Then you understand what happens if we lose major accounts. If your business depends on my signing something false, that is a business problem. Her mouth tightened. It isn't false. We've done that argument. Dad held up one hand. Can we slow down? Courtney ignored him. The vendor process was an opportunity to stabilize a lot of work. More predictable contracts mean more predictable shifts. Then correct the packet and let the review continue based on what Sterling actually has. You know a correction like that can kill confidence. Then why was my name worth putting there in the first place? Courtney looked away. That was the question she never answered directly. Dad leaned forward. Sarah, I think what Courtney is trying to say is that there's a difference between acknowledging you helped and claiming you were on payroll. I agree. He seemed relieved until I continued. The packet did not say, Courtney's sister once helped with an early handbook. It gave me a current professional role. Dad rubbed his forehead. Maybe the wording was too broad. Then it should be corrected. Immediately? Courtney asked. With no consideration for what that does? I stared at her. When exactly would the truth become less damaging? After the vendor review is resolved? That is not how verification works. You always think process is sacred. No. I think if somebody asks me whether I currently advise your company, I should answer the question honestly. Courtney pushed her plate away. Easy for you. There was that phrase again. What is easy for me? You don't have employees depending on you. You don't have a company you spent 6 years building. You go to work, do your job, go home, and if something goes wrong, there's an organization above you. I am the organization. I could have answered with something cutting. Instead, I let myself consider what she was saying. There was truth inside it. Courtney did carry risks I did not carry. She had created Sterling from almost nothing. She had won clients, hired people, survived slow seasons, and learned parts of business I had never needed to learn. I had also spent years quietly dismissing much of what she valued because branding, networking, and social positioning did not impress me. I probably have underestimated how hard it is to run Sterling, I said. Courtney's expression shifted, almost surprised. I continued before she mistook the sentence for surrender. That still doesn't turn me into your advisor. Mom dropped her napkin beside her plate. This is what I don't understand. She's your sister. She used your background because you helped her. Maybe she should have asked more clearly, but families help each other. I did help her. Exactly. In 2019. Mom's voice sharpened. Why does everything need an expiration date with you? Because professional responsibility does. Courtney laughed under her breath. I looked at Mom. If I once helped you fill out an insurance form, would that make me your insurance advisor 6 years later? That is not the same thing. Why? Because this is family. I almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. That is the part you think changes the answer. Dad put his hands flat on the table. There's another reason we're concerned. Courtney looked at him quickly. It was the first time all afternoon I saw her react before choosing her expression. What reason? I asked. Dad glanced at Mom. Mom stared at her plate. Then he said, Your mother and I have money in Sterling. I had known they had helped Courtney when she started. I had assumed they had given her a small loan or covered some early expenses the way parents sometimes help an adult child. I had never asked for details because it was not my money. How much? Dad did not answer immediately. Dad, $120,000 total. For a moment, the room went completely quiet. I looked from him to Mom, then to Courtney. You put $120,000 into her company? Not all at once, Mom said quickly. Over several years. Was it a loan? Dad shook his head. Equity. That changed the shape of the table. Not morally. Financially. My parents did not have old family money. Dad had spent decades in accounting management. Mom had worked in medical administration before retiring. They owned their house, had retirement accounts, and lived comfortably because they had saved carefully. $120,000 was not everything they had, but it was enough that losing most of it would hurt. How much of that came from retirement savings? I asked. Mom stiffened. We are not destitute. That wasn't my question. Dad said. We moved things around. We knew there was risk. I looked at Courtney. And you let them put that much in? She flinched. I didn't force them. I didn't say you did. Dad interrupted. We made our own decision. Don't turn this into Courtney taking advantage of us. I'm not. But suddenly, I understood more of the pressure surrounding me. Mom was not simply defending her favorite daughter. Dad was not simply trying to preserve family peace. Their money was tied to Sterling's value. Every delayed contract, every client concern, every review affected something they had spent decades accumulating. Mom leaned toward me. That is why we're asking you to think about the whole family. There it was. I felt sympathy for them. Real sympathy. That was what made the moment difficult. It would have been easier if my parents were cartoonishly wealthy, or if the money meant nothing to them. Instead, I could picture Dad calculating retirement withdrawals at the kitchen table. I could picture Mom pretending she was not worried about whether an investment she had bragged about for years could collapse. But compassion did not alter facts. I am thinking about the whole family, I said. That includes me. Mom looked hurt. Nobody said it didn't. You're asking me to sign a statement I've told you is inaccurate because your investment may lose value. Dad frowned. I have not asked you to sign anything. Not yet. Courtney pushed her chair back slightly. You make us sound disgusting. I'm describing the choice in front of me. No, you're making yourself the victim again. I looked directly at her. I'm not a victim. I'm the person whose name you used. There's a difference. That silenced her for a few seconds. I took a drink of water and set the glass down carefully. Here is what I will do. If Sterling corrects how my name was used and stops representing me as an advisor, I will not turn this into a public spectacle. I will not post about the wedding. I will not call your clients. I will not contact the press. I will not use your mistake as an excuse to humiliate you back. Courtney stared at me. How generous. It isn't generosity, it's a boundary. I want the false representation corrected. I do not want revenge through gossip. Dad asked. And the employee complaints? Not mine to decide. Courtney made a frustrated sound. Your office is handling them. People at my employer are handling whatever was brought to them. I am not. Convenient. No, necessary. I looked at all three of them. If there are pay issues, an independent review needs to determine what happened and what needs to be corrected. I am not calculating what anyone is owed. I am not bargaining on behalf of workers. I am not promising Sterling will survive. Those decisions do not belong to me. Mom's face had tightened with worry. And if correcting your name destroys the vendor opportunity before any of that gets sorted out, then the vendor opportunity was relying on information that should not have been there. Courtney's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. You really don't care who gets hurt. I stayed seated. I care enough not to sign something false and make the problem harder to fix later. You think you're so smart. I think paper lasts. Her eyes flashed. Dad said her name, but Courtney had already grabbed her wine glass and carried it toward the kitchen. Mom started to rise after her. I expected her to follow, but Dad said, Linda, let her cool down. For the first time that day, Courtney was out of the room, and nobody immediately reorganized the conversation around her feelings. Dad looked tired. So that's it? He asked. There's nothing you're willing to do? I just told you what I'm willing to do. You won't sign. No. You won't soften the correction. I already wrote the most neutral version I could honestly write. He glanced toward the kitchen. She could lose a lot. So could you. His eyes came back to mine. That matters to me, I said. But it doesn't make the statement true. Dad nodded once, slowly, as though he had expected the answer, but still hoped hearing the full financial picture would change it. Then he made the mistake that changed the rest of my Thanksgiving. We didn't think you'd mind her using your background. You helped her before. I went still. Mom immediately looked at him. Dad seemed to realize something had left his mouth that he had not planned to say. I leaned forward. Using my background where? He picked up his water even though the glass was nearly full. I'm speaking generally. No, you're not. Sarah, you said we didn't think you'd mind. Who is we? Mom cut in. Your father is just saying we all knew you had helped Courtney. That isn't what he said. Dad stared at the table. I could feel the old family instinct trying to activate around me. Mom smoothing. Dad retreating. Courtney absent but somehow still protected by the silence. Years ago, I might have filled the silence myself just to make everyone comfortable. I did not. Dad, did you know my professional background was being used in the vendor packet? He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his napkin. Mom answered for him. He was only helping with formatting. I turned to her. I didn't ask what he was helping with. Don't interrogate your father. I asked one question. He helps Courtney with bookkeeping and documents sometimes. That doesn't mean he knew every word. I looked back at Dad. Did you know my name was in that packet? He still did not answer. That was the answer. Something inside me shifted, and it was different from the anger I had felt toward Courtney. Courtney had always been capable of bending a story until it served her. Dad was the person I had trusted to notice numbers, dates, wording, the quiet, factual things nobody else cared about. He had taught me to read contracts before signing them. He had taught me that if something felt unclear, you asked until it was clear. Now he could not answer a yes or no question. How long did you know? I asked. Sarah, stop, Mom said. Dad finally looked at me. It wasn't like you think. I haven't told you what I think. You're acting like we conspired against you. I'm asking when you found out. There were a lot of documents. Did you see mine? He hesitated again. Courtney returned from the kitchen before he answered. She took one look at Dad's face, then mine, and understood that something had changed. What happened? I stood. Mom's voice rose. Sarah, don't leave like this. I told Dad before I came exactly when I would leave. No one insulted you. I said I would leave if I was pressured to sign, or if this stopped being a conversation. This is a conversation. No, this is 3 people asking me to make an inaccurate statement safer because all 3 of you have something invested in Courtney's version. Dad flinched at that. Courtney folded her arms. What did Dad say? I looked at her. Ask him. Her eyes moved toward him. That was when I knew she was worried. Not about the argument, about what he might say. I picked up my coat from the chair near the front door. Mom followed me into the hallway, speaking in the urgent whisper she used when she wanted to fight without letting the neighbors imagine we were a family that fought. You're punishing us for helping your sister. I turned toward her. No, you invested in a business. That was your choice. Dad helped with paperwork. That was his choice. Courtney used my professional identity. That was hers. I am responsible for one choice here, and that is whether I lie now to make everybody else's choices cheaper. Mom's eyes filled, which hurt more than I wanted it to. You would let your father lose his savings over this? I am not making Dad lose anything. You know what could happen. Yes. And you can live with that? I thought carefully before answering because I did not want anger speaking for me. I can live with telling the truth. I don't know if I could live with signing something false and wondering who paid for it later. Mom looked away. I opened the door. Behind her, Dad had come into the hallway. He looked older than he had at dinner. Sarah. I paused. He seemed about to say something, then stopped. I waited. Nothing came, so I left. The streets were mostly empty as I drove home. Porch lights glowed behind bare trees. And every few houses I passed a driveway crowded with cars from families still sitting around tables together. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and sad, and more certain than I had been before dinner that the problem was larger than Courtney's wording. My parents' investment explained their fear. It did not explain Dad's silence. He had not reacted like a man who had discovered that afternoon that his daughter had used my name carelessly. He had reacted like a man who already knew there was a question he did not want me to ask. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Thanksgiving had stopped being about whether Courtney had stretched one old favor into a current professional relationship. I was thinking about September, when the vendor packet had been prepared. Dad had helped Courtney with bookkeeping and documents. He had seen enough to know my background was being used. The question was no longer whether he knew. The question was when he knew. what he had asked Courtney before the packet went out, and what she had said that made him send it anyway. Dad waited 4 days after Thanksgiving before asking to see me alone. He did not call from the family group chat or ask Mom to arrange it. He sent a text shortly after 7 on Monday morning saying he wanted to explain what he had meant at dinner and that he would meet wherever I chose. I suggested a small breakfast place near my office because I did not want the conversation happening in my parents' house, where every difficult discussion eventually became a referendum on whether I was upsetting Mom. Dad arrived before me and had already ordered coffee. He looked tired enough that I almost felt guilty for noticing how much older he seemed. Almost. I sat across from him and put my phone face down beside my mug. You said you didn't think I'd mind Courtney using my background. Dad nodded slowly. I chose my words badly. That isn't what I asked. He looked toward the window. I helped her compile some of the vendor material. How much? Formatting, financial schedules, supporting documents, things she gave me to organize. You saw my name. Yes. The word was quiet, but at least it was finally a word. Before the packet was submitted? Yes. Did you ask why it was there? Dad rubbed one hand over his jaw. I asked if you knew. I studied him. That is a very careful sentence. It is what happened. Did you ask Courtney, directly, whether I had approved being listed as an independent workforce compliance advisor? I asked if you knew she was using your professional background. That is not the same question. I understand that now. You understood it then. He looked at me sharply. Sarah, you spent your career in accounting. You know the difference between somebody knowing their sister once helped a company and somebody consenting to be presented as a current advisor. Dad dropped his eyes to his coffee. Courtney said you had helped before. She said you had given her material. She said this was not some fabricated credential. And that satisfied you? At the time, I thought it was clumsy wording, not a scheme. I let the silence sit between us. Dad had always been uncomfortable with silence when he knew he was losing control of a conversation. He began straightening the paper sleeve around his cup even though there was nothing wrong with it. Finally, he said, I was trying to help her get the application finished. You were being paid to help. His hands stopped. Mom had mentioned that Dad helped with the books after retirement, but nobody had ever described the arrangement clearly. Are you a Sterling employee? Part-time. Technically, I'm a contractor. For bookkeeping? Mostly. Monthly reconciliations. Accounts payable reports. Helping Courtney's operations person prepare information for the accountant. Sometimes payroll scheduling files. The last phrase caught my attention, but I did not follow it yet. Are you an officer? No. CLAFO? No. Do you set compensation policy? No. Do you decide what Sterling pays workers? No. Then don't let anybody start calling you the man who runs the financial side of Sterling. His eyebrows lifted. Who said they were? Nobody yet. I'm telling you not to make yourself bigger inside this story just because you feel guilty. Dad leaned back. For the first time since we sat down, some of the defensiveness left his face. I made mistakes. Yes. I'm trying to tell you that. You're trying to tell me you meant well. He did not deny it. That isn't the same thing, I continued. I can understand why you were afraid. I can understand why you wanted Courtney's company to succeed. I can understand why $120,000 of your and Mom's money made you want to believe every problem was temporary. I can understand all of that and still think you were wrong. His face hardened slightly. You make it sound like we invested because Courtney manipulated us. I didn't say that. You keep bringing up the money because until Thanksgiving, I did not know you had $120,000 of minority equity tied up in the company whose packet you helped assemble. We made that investment willingly. I believe you, and Sterling was doing well. I believe that too. Dad watched me as if he were waiting for the trap. There doesn't have to be a trap, I said. You can make a reasonable investment and later make an unreasonable decision, because you're scared of losing it. That landed harder than anything else I had said. Dad had spent most of my childhood warning me not to throw good money after bad and not to let sunk costs determine future choices. I could see him hearing his own lectures in my voice. He looked away. I never thought your name was going to be a problem. That is part of the problem. None of you thought I needed to be asked. He pressed his lips together. I did not ask him to show me his emails. Not yet. He had come to explain what he knew, and I wanted to see how much he would volunteer without being forced. More importantly, I was not going to turn myself into an investigator rummaging through Sterling's internal records. The company already had outside processes asking questions. My job was to stay inside the narrow lane that actually belonged to me. Dad finished half his coffee before he spoke again. Courtney thinks you're trying to destroy her marriage now. That surprised me enough to make me laugh once. How? She says Blake knew Sterling was applying to his company. He knew his people liked the packet. She thinks you've made him suspicious of her over something he already understood. I stopped smiling. What exactly did she say Blake knew? That Sterling was bidding, that his team thought the application was strong. She said he knew she was using outside compliance guidance. Did she say he knew my name was in it? Dad hesitated. She implied it. Implied. She said his people loved the packet. That is not the same thing. Sarah, I'm telling you what she said. I knew that, but the possibility stayed with me after we left breakfast. Blake had told me he was recused. I had believed him because there had been no reason not to. Still, I had also assumed a chief executive would be insulated from some of the details of a vendor review, not necessarily every mention of a company his fiancée owned. Courtney's version gave my own worst suspicions somewhere to grow. What if Blake had known more than he admitted? The idea embarrassed me because I could feel exactly where it came from. Blake was powerful, wealthy, and accustomed to rooms where other people waited for his decisions. Part of me had begun treating those facts as evidence. I had criticized Courtney for thinking status told her who mattered, yet I was now letting Blake's title tell me what he must have known. I did not call him. I did not accuse him. I did the same thing I had done when the first vendor email arrived. I waited for something I could actually verify. 2 days later, the answer came without me asking for special access. The compliance analyst handling the correction to my professional information sent an update. Sterling's review remained on hold while the inaccurate advisor reference was being addressed. The message stated that the vendor process had documented an executive conflict disclosure months earlier, when Blake and Courtney became engaged. Blake had formally recused himself from Sterling's scoring, detailed compliance review, and approval path. He had not been given the detailed appendices after recusal. The analyst was not defending Blake to me. She was explaining why the company could not treat the existence of his relationship with Courtney as prior approval of the information in Sterling's packet. I read the message twice. Then I felt foolish. Not because suspicion was forbidden, but because I had almost let a person's position substitute for evidence. I had spent years telling workers not to assume a manager knew something, just because the manager sat higher on an organization chart. Information moved through systems in specific ways. Authority did not equal omniscience. Blake had known Sterling was pursuing business with Harrington Hospitality. He had not reviewed the pages containing my name. Courtney had known that distinction when she told our parents his people loved the packet. She had not technically said Blake approved my role. She had simply arranged the sentence so everyone listening would finish it for her. I was starting to admire the technique even while I hated what she did with it. The same vendor update also clarified something else. My old 2019 material did not satisfy their requirement for current independent oversight. A 6-year-old handbook review for a 7-person company was not evidence that I supervised a regional staffing operation with more than 100 workers in busy periods. Sterling could correct the reference and continue through whatever review remained appropriate, but the process would not simply resume as though nothing had happened. It also had not been canceled. That distinction mattered. Courtney was already telling Mom that I had killed the Harrington deal. I had not. The vendor eligibility process was paused because information required verification and other review work was still underway. Whether Sterling eventually qualified was not mine to decide. Dad called again that evening. This time he did not ask to meet. He sounded different, less defensive, and more frightened. Did you hear anything from the vendor side? I got an update about my correction. Is Sterling out? No. He exhaled. It's still on hold, I added. His relief disappeared. For how long? I don't know. Did they say what else they need? Dad, I'm not part of Sterling's application. I know. I'm asking what they told you. They told me about the material involving me. That's it. He was quiet. Then he said, Courtney needs this account. You've all said that. No, I don't think you understand. I walked from my kitchen into the living room and sat on the arm of the couch. Then explain it without asking me to sign anything. Dad hesitated long enough that I knew numbers were coming. Sterling has an operating line. That isn't unusual. No? How large? I'm not giving you company financials over the phone. Then why bring it up? Because the line is personally guaranteed by Courtney. I straightened. That was new, Dad continued. Part of the commercial lease has a personal guarantee too. She signed those when Sterling expanded. So if the company fails, she doesn't just lose equity. No. How much personal exposure? I'm not going into exact figures. That's fine. I didn't ask you to send me statements. She has real risk here, Sarah. I understand. No, I'm not sure you do. If that vendor relationship had come through on schedule, it would have given Sterling more predictable volume. Better forecasting. More cash moving through. You keep describing growth. I'm describing stability. Those are not always the same thing. Dad went silent. I thought about the luxurious ballroom in October, the polished Sterling logo, Courtney moving between executives as though the company had nowhere to go except upward. None of that proved Sterling was healthy or unhealthy. A wedding was not a balance sheet. And Courtney's personal wedding spending had nothing to do with Sterling's payroll. But the contrast bothered me for another reason. Courtney had made expansion look like success already achieved. Dad was describing expansion as something the company needed in order to breathe. When did the cash pressure start? I asked. Every staffing company has cash pressure. That was not my question. Clients pay after events. Payroll happens before invoices clear. You know that. I do. Some accounts pay in 30 days. Some take longer. Also normal. Exactly. Then why does Courtney need one specific account badly enough for everyone to keep asking me to change a statement? Dad exhaled slowly. There were a few clients that paid later than expected. How late? I'm not discussing receivables. Then don't. Tell me whether Sterling can meet its current obligations without Harrington. That depends what you mean by meet. I closed my eyes. That phrase frightened me more than a clean no would have. Dad, Sterling is not bankrupt. I didn't say it was. It has assets, it has active clients, it has bookings. Can it pay what it owes when it owes it? He did not answer. For the first time, I stopped thinking of the Harrington vendor opportunity as something Courtney wanted because it would make Sterling bigger. Maybe it had once been that. By December, it sounded like something she needed because another large stream of revenue might buy time. Does Mom know this? She knows business has been tight. Does she know about Courtney's personal guarantees? Yes. That explains a lot. Don't be cruel. I'm not being cruel. I'm saying Mom isn't just afraid of losing her investment anymore. She's afraid Courtney could lose personal assets too. You would be afraid if she were your daughter. She is my sister. I am concerned. You have a strange way of showing it. I stood and walked back toward the kitchen. Concern does not require me to create a false professional history. Dad made a frustrated sound. I am not asking you to sign that statement. Good. I'm asking you to understand what's at stake. I do understand. What I don't understand is why every new thing at stake becomes an argument for why somebody else should absorb Courtney's risk. That's not fair. Then tell me what is. He lowered his voice. If the Harrington account comes in, Courtney gets breathing room. She can normalize things. Everybody stops panicking. The word normalize stopped me. Normalize what? Cash flow. That is vague. It is a business, Sarah. Cash flow is always moving. Dad, I don't know what you want from me. I want you to stop speaking like an accountant when you're trying not to say something. He went silent. The longer it lasted, the worse my stomach felt. You said you helped with payroll scheduling files. Yes. What does that mean? It means I sometimes prepare timing reports based on instructions from Courtney in operations. Timing of what? Disbursements, payroll runs, vendor payments. Are employees being paid late? No? The answer came too quickly. Then why did you hesitate? Because I knew you'd turn this into something. I cannot turn facts into something they aren't. Some timing has shifted. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. What timing? It's not as dramatic as you're making it sound. I haven't made it sound like anything. You still haven't answered. Dad breathed into the phone. Finally he said, Sterling is a little behind. Behind on what? Another silence. Dad, payroll timing. The room seemed to narrow around me. I did not ask which employees. I did not ask how many hours. I did not ask whether Elena was involved. Those questions belonged to the independent process I had already removed myself from, and I was not going to use my father as a back door into a worker case. Instead, I asked the only thing I could responsibly ask him. Is this why Courtney needs the Harrington account? It would help. That is not what I asked. It would stabilize things. How long has this been happening? I'm not discussing details. Then don't, but stop telling me this is only about expansion. Dad's voice became defensive again. Nobody is stealing payroll. I didn't say that. People are getting paid. I didn't say they weren't. It's timing. That word again. Temporary, timing, bridge, delay. Every bad system I had ever seen had started with language designed to make the present sound too small to worry about. Dad continued. Once receivables catch up, it gets corrected. Courtney just needs some room. I looked at the vendor email still open on my laptop. Harrington was not a reward at the end of Courtney's growth plan anymore. In my mind, it had become money that did not yet exist being counted on to repair obligations that already did. Dad, future revenue is not the same thing as money you already owe. You think I don't know that? I think you know it better than almost anyone. He said nothing. And that, I continued, is why I don't understand how you got this far. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me. Instead, his voice went flat. Nothing is permanent. I closed my eyes. He meant it to reassure me. It did the opposite. Because I had spent my career watching temporary problems turn into policies. Policies turn into habits. And habits turn into systems everyone claimed they had never intended to build. Dad said it again, quieter this time. Payroll timing. Nothing permanent. By then, I knew better than to believe that something stopped being dangerous just because everyone involved planned to fix it later. The morning after Dad told me Sterling was a little behind on payroll timing, I went into work with the uncomfortable feeling that I knew both too much and not enough. I knew enough to understand that Courtney's company was under pressure. I knew enough to understand why the Harrington contract mattered so much to her. But I did not know which workers had been affected, how much money was involved, or what the records showed, and because Elena's matter was being handled by people I worked beside every day, those were exactly the questions I was not allowed to answer for myself. I asked my supervisor for 10 minutes before our first meeting. I told her my father had volunteered information about Sterling's cash flow and mentioned that some payroll timing had shifted. I did not repeat names, speculate about Elena, or ask whether any of that matched what the clinic was seeing. My supervisor listened, then asked me the question I needed to hear. Does any of that change the fact that you are recused from the worker matter? I said no. She nodded. Then your job is not to find the missing pieces. Your job is to stay out of the room where those pieces are being assembled. I admitted that doing nothing felt irresponsible. She corrected me immediately. You are not doing nothing. You disclosed the conflict. You removed yourself. You corrected the use of your professional identity. You preserved your own records. Those are actions. Then she leaned back and added, people who are good at solving problems sometimes think responsibility means touching every lever. Sometimes responsibility means knowing which lever is not yours. That stayed with me because it described one of my weaknesses better than I liked. I had always thought my problem was that I cared too little about appearances. In reality, I also trusted competence too much. If I could see how something worked, I instinctively wanted to fix it. But Sterling's workers did not need Courtney's older sister deciding what justice looked like for them, even if that older sister happened to work in worker advocacy. They needed people without family money, old resentments, or Thanksgiving arguments clouding the process. So I made myself a rule. If information came to me because I was Sarah Mitchell, Courtney's sister, I could respond as Sarah. If information belonged to the clinic's worker matter, I would not touch it. If Courtney wanted to discuss my name, I would discuss my name. If she wanted me to negotiate pay claims or tell her what investigators might do, the conversation would end. I had no idea how quickly she would test that rule. 2 nights later, Courtney showed up at my townhouse without calling. I saw her through the front window standing beneath the porch light in a wool coat, arms folded tightly across her chest. There was no makeup, no perfect blowout, no founder smile. When I opened the door, she looked exhausted enough that for a moment I forgot how angry I was with her. "Can I come in?" she asked. "If this is about Elena's case, no." Her jaw tightened. "Everything isn't Elena's case." "Then tell me what this is about." "My company. That covers a lot." "Sarah, please." I stepped aside. Courtney walked into my living room and looked around as though she had not been there in years, which was almost true. My townhouse was modest, quiet, and about as far from Courtney's preferred aesthetic as a place could get. I owned furniture because it was comfortable. She owned furniture because it photographed well. Years earlier, I had judged her for that more than I should have, and I knew it. She sat on the edge of the couch but did not remove her coat. "Dad told me you know things are tight. He told me Sterling has cash flow pressure, and some payroll timing has shifted." She closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he did. He did not give me records." "Good." "Why is that good?" "Because you'd look at one spreadsheet and decide I'm running a criminal enterprise." I sat across from her. "You keep accusing me of things I haven't done. You work at a labor clinic. What do you want me to think?" "I want you to think I know what a conflict is." Courtney looked down at her hands. "Fine. Then don't be a labor advocate for 5 minutes. Be my sister. I can be your sister without pretending facts disappear." That is exactly the kind of sentence that makes me want to scream. I waited. She stood and began pacing near the window. "Do you know how staffing works? Really works? Not from a complaint file. From the business side? Some. No, you know what happens after people are angry. You don't know what it takes before that." She turned toward me. "Clients book 100 people for a weekend. We schedule them, they work. Payroll hits before some clients pay. 30 days is normal. 60 happens. Sometimes longer if there is a dispute over an invoice. Meanwhile, taxes, insurance, uniforms, software, rent, workers' comp, everything else keeps moving. I understand receivables. You understand the definition. I also understand that employees are not accounts receivable." Her face hardened. "There. That. What?" "That tone. Like I don't understand that these are human beings." "I didn't say you don't. You didn't have to." Courtney returned to the couch and finally removed her coat. Underneath, she wore a plain gray sweater that made her look younger. "Sterling grew faster than our working capital. That is the truth. It doesn't mean the company is fake. It doesn't mean I'm stealing from anybody. It means sometimes money coming in and money going out don't line up perfectly." I thought about Dad's phrase, payroll timing. How are you handling that gap? She stared at me. "I'm not asking which worker got what," I said. "I'm asking what you mean when you call it a timing problem. Sometimes items get corrected in the next cycle." "Items," she rolled her eyes. "Hours, adjustments, overtime, whatever accounting needs to reconcile." "Do the workers agree to finance Sterling?" Courtney went completely still. I had not planned the sentence. It simply came out because her explanation had stripped away every euphemism until that was what remained. "That is not what's happening. If somebody works this week and money they earned gets pushed into a later cycle because Sterling needs cash now, whose money is bridging the gap?" "You are twisting it. I'm asking a question. They get paid. Eventually? Don't. Courtney, I am not asking you to tell me anything about a specific claim. I'm asking whether your business model is relying on workers waiting for money they already earned. You make it sound intentional. Is it?" She shot to her feet again. "Do you have any idea how insulting that is?" I stayed seated. "You came to my house to explain." "I came because Dad said you might actually listen. I am listening. No, you are building a case in your head. I am trying to understand the thing you want me to protect. That stopped her. For a moment, she looked less angry than cornered. I don't want you to protect anything, she said. You wanted me to sign a statement. That was about your name. You said the statement would help the vendor review, and the vendor review would help Sterling. Because it would. So what do you want from me tonight? Courtney looked away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. Time. There it was. Not vindication. Not a declaration that every accusation was false. Time. How much? 1/4. For what? For receivables to catch up. For the winter bookings to clear. For us to get through the Harrington decision and a few renewals. And then, I fix everything. The certainty frightened me because I could tell she believed it. What does everything mean? Everything that's behind. I'm not asking for numbers. I know. Then what are you asking me to do for 1/4? She lowered herself onto the couch again. Stop pushing. I'm not pushing the worker case. You corrected the vendor packet. Because it used my name. You could have waited. No. Why? Because verification was happening now. Exactly. If you had waited until after the award, it wouldn't have mattered. I stared at her. Courtney heard herself a second too late. She tried to recover. I mean, it wouldn't have changed whether we were qualified. That is not what you said. Oh, for God's sake. You just told me you wanted inaccurate information to survive long enough to get the award. It was not inaccurate. We are back to that? You helped Sterling 6 years ago. You helped shape the foundation. Courtney, if the difference between getting a contract and losing it is whether people think I currently oversee your company, then my role obviously matters. Her eyes filled with angry tears. You think I need you that badly? I think you needed my name badly enough to use it without asking. She wiped beneath one eye with the heel of her hand, annoyed at herself for crying. You have no idea what it is like to have everyone waiting for you to fail. I almost answered that nobody was waiting for her to fail. Then I remembered being 20. Watching Courtney walk into family gatherings already convinced someone was comparing us. I remembered teachers calling her Sarah's little sister. I remembered relatives asking whether she would go into advocacy too because I had. I had never created those comparisons, but I had benefited from them. Maybe I don't, I said. Courtney looked up. You were always the social one, I continued. People liked you faster than they liked me. You understood rooms I didn't care about. You knew how to make people remember you. Her laugh was bitter. And you thought that was shallow. Sometimes I did. Sometimes. Often. At least you admit it. I was wrong to assume networking was meaningless just because I didn't value it the way you did. Something changed in her face. For several seconds, she was not fighting me. She was listening. Then I said, I was not wrong about my name. The opening closed immediately. Of course, both things can be true. No. With you, only one thing ever matters. You get to be right. That isn't what I said. You were always the smart daughter. The reliable one. Sarah gets good grades. Sarah gets the serious job. Sarah cares about important things. Her voice sharpened. As years of resentment suddenly found a shape, I was the fun one. The one who knew how to throw a party. The one who could talk to anybody. Nobody called that intelligence until I started making money from it. I did not interrupt. When Sterling started working big venues, Dad finally talked about me the way he used to talk about you. Mom showed people my articles. People asked me for advice. I walked into rooms where nobody knew I was your sister. She laughed once, painfully. Do you know what that felt like? I did not pretend I did. No. It felt like finally having something that was mine. The sentence hurt because it was honest. Then she added, and now the first time you get close to it, everything starts falling apart. There was the lie hidden inside the truth. I did not create your cash flow problem. I know. I did not make a worker come to my clinic. I know. I did not write my name into your packet. She said nothing. I'm not taking Sterling away from you. You don't have to. You can just refuse to help until everyone else does it for you. That was when my sympathy reached its limit. I will not accept responsibility for consequences that existed before I knew about them. Courtney looked down. I leaned forward. You want to know what I can actually do? I can make this part simple. She waited. Correct the packet. Remove my name. Tell the vendor team I do not currently advise Sterling. Stop asking me for retroactive consent. Do not use my bio, my employer, or old training material in a way that suggests I oversee what your company does now. And then what? That is my part. What about the payroll review? Not my part. You know how much damage that could do. I do not control it. You could talk to your people. No. Sara. No. If there is an independent payroll or legal review, cooperate with it. Let the people handling it determine what records show and what needs to happen. I will not negotiate repayment, retaliation, or worker remedies for you or against you. Courtney stared at me as though I had deliberately refused to throw her a rope. I continued. I will also make you a promise. If you correct the record about me, I will not use the wedding humiliation to retaliate personally. I will not post about you. I will not call your clients. I will not turn nobody into some viral story about how my sister got exposed. I want my name out of something I never approved. That is all I am asking from you. She gave me a look I could not read. You think that makes you generous? No, I think it makes the boundary clear. What if correcting it now triggers more questions? Then answer them. What if lenders get nervous? Then talk to your lender. What if clients hear about the review? Then tell them what you can truthfully tell them. What if Sterling loses the Harrington opportunity? I held her gaze. Then Sterling loses an opportunity. You can say that because you don't have your house tied to a guarantee. I know about the guarantees. Her eyes widened. Dad told you? He told me enough. Courtney stood again. He had no right. I almost laughed. Interesting choice of words. This is my company, and my name was my name. She glared at me. There was a time when that look would have pulled me into a fight. Instead, I waited. Finally, Courtney said, If I correct everything now, it makes Sterling look unstable at exactly the moment we cannot afford to look unstable. That doesn't make the correction less true. You really don't understand financing. Maybe not the way you do. But I understand that the solution to looking unstable cannot be to keep false stability on paper until someone gives you money. It isn't false stability. You just told me you need 1 quarter. 1 quarter can change everything. That is what Dad said in different words. Because it's true. No, it's a plan. What is the difference? A plan is something you hope will happen. An obligation is something you already owe. She stared at me with raw frustration. The Harrington contract fixes the gap. You don't have the contract. We could. You don't. We were the strongest regional candidate. Then let Sterling qualify based on Sterling. You know that isn't how business works. Then I'm even less interested in having my name used to make it work. Courtney grabbed her coat from the back of the couch. For a second, I thought she would leave without another word. But she stopped at the door and turned toward me. You know what your real problem is? I assume you're going to tell me. You think being right is the same thing as being good. The sentence landed because there was enough truth in it to hurt. I had been right and unkind before. I had dismissed people because I thought their priorities were foolish. I had underestimated Courtney's skill because her talents were not the ones I respected most. I knew all of that. But none of it changed what she was asking me to do. My problem, I said, is that I sometimes think evidence should be enough to make people change their minds. Apparently it isn't. Her expression hardened. You know what you need to do, I continued. You know how to correct my part of this. Whether you do it is your decision. Courtney put on her coat. I need time. You have already had time. I need 1 contract. You need a correction. I can fix this after the next quarter. Then you're choosing not to fix it now. Her hand froze on the doorknob. For several seconds, neither of us moved. That was the moment I stopped thinking Courtney was trapped by a mistake she did not know how to undo. I had given her a clean path out of the part involving me. She understood it. She understood the risk. She understood exactly what I would and would not do. And she chose delay. Courtney opened the door, but before she stepped outside, she looked back. If you want someone to blame for payroll, talk to Dad. He handled the schedules. I felt something cold move through me. You own the company. Ownership doesn't mean I entered every number. Did Dad decide when people got paid? He prepared the schedules. He moved things when they needed to be moved. On whose instructions? Courtney's face changed. Not much. Just enough. I'm done talking about this, she said. She stepped onto the porch. I followed her as far as the doorway. Courtney, she turned. If payroll was delayed because of bookkeeping mistakes, that is one thing. If Dad executed instructions from you, that is another. Ask him. You're the owner, and he was the one handling the files. Then she walked toward her car. I watched her leave without calling Dad. Not because I suddenly trusted him. Not because I thought he was innocent. Dad had already admitted enough for me to know he had participated in decisions he should have challenged. But I recognized what Courtney had just done. For years, when something in our family became uncomfortable, the consequence moved toward the person most likely to absorb it. Sometimes that person had been me. I was the reliable daughter, so I could handle disappointment. I did not need praise. I would understand. I would get over it. Now Courtney's company was in danger, and for the first time since the wedding, she had pointed away from me. Toward Dad, I closed the door and stood in my quiet living room, thinking about the way she had phrased it. Not, Dad made a mistake. Not, Dad misunderstood. She had said if I wanted someone to blame for payroll, I should talk to him. Courtney had not confessed to anything. She had done something more revealing. She had started choosing her scapegoat. By the second week of January, Courtney had stopped calling me about Sterling. That should have felt like relief. Instead, the silence made me more cautious because she had not stopped talking about what was happening. She had simply changed audiences. Mom told me Blake and Courtney were taking some space after several arguments about the vendor review and the way Courtney had described my role in Sterling. I did not ask for details. Their marriage was theirs, and Blake had already shown me he knew how to keep himself out of a process where he had a conflict. What mattered to me was the other shift I began hearing from Dad. The phrase payroll timing disappeared. In its place came bookkeeping errors. And every time Dad used those words, he sounded less like a man explaining a problem, and more like a man repeating language somebody had handed him. He called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if he could come over. His voice was flat, stripped of the defensiveness I had heard at Thanksgiving and the fear I had heard in December. When he arrived, he carried his laptop bag but left it beside the front door. He stood in my living room for a moment before sitting, as if he had forgotten why he had come. Courtney had a meeting at the house yesterday, he said. Your mother was there. So was the lawyer Sterling hired for the business side. I waited. Dad looked at his hands. I need to tell you what they asked me to do. I did not know what had happened at that meeting because I had not been there. What I knew came from Dad sitting across from me afterward and telling me what he remembered. Courtney had asked him to sign a written statement describing payroll administration as his domain. According to Dad, the draft emphasized that he prepared payroll schedules, handled bookkeeping files, reconciled accounts, and communicated timing adjustments to operations. None of those statements was completely false. That was what made the document dangerous. It took the things Dad really did and arranged them, so a reader could conclude he had independently created the decisions now under review. She said I was the numbers person, he told me. She said she trusted me to manage the mechanics. Did you? Manage the mechanics? Make the decisions. Dad looked away. Some. Which ones? I prepared schedules. I moved entries when I was instructed. Sometimes I flagged problems. Sometimes I told Courtney we were running too tight. Did you decide that overtime should move to another cycle? His face tightened. Not by myself. That is not the same as no. I know. I leaned back and gave myself a second before speaking again. I did not want to make the mistake my family kept making, where responsibility had to belong entirely to one person so everyone else could feel clean. Dad had participated. He had already admitted that. If Courtney had told him to do something he knew was wrong and he did it anyway, her instruction did not erase his choice. At the same time, his involvement did not magically transform Courtney into an owner who knew nothing because someone else touched the spreadsheet. What exactly does she want the statement to say? I asked. That payroll issues came from bookkeeping execution. Your execution? Yes. And what did you say? I said I needed to think about it. That means you didn't sign. No. Dad rubbed his palms together. Then your mother said Courtney has her whole life ahead of her. I watched him carefully. What did she mean? She said I'm retired. I have Social Security. I have a house. Courtney has a business, a marriage, a reputation. If I made mistakes in the books, I could explain them. I could take responsibility. Did she use those words? Dad nodded. Take responsibility. There was a difference between accountability and being volunteered as damage control. My mother had apparently decided that because Dad was older, his reputation was cheaper. Courtney's future mattered more because she had more years left to use it. It was the same arithmetic my family had used on me for years, just with a different person in the losing column. I felt angry for Dad. And then I reminded myself that sympathy could not become absolution. You did make mistakes, I said. He flinched. I know. So if you tell the truth, some of it will hurt you. I know that too. Then don't sign something that makes your part bigger or smaller than it was. Dad stared at me. That's why I came to you. I need help explaining it. No. The answer surprised him. No? I'll tell you what I think you should do procedurally. I am not writing your story for you. You know how to organize facts. So do you. This is different. It is different because you are inside it. He looked toward the laptop bag by my door. I brought the computer. You could look through the emails with me. Help me build a timeline. I shook my head before he finished. Do not give me your laptop. Why? Because I have no business taking possession of Sterling records. I work at the clinic involved in a worker matter against Sterling. Even though I am recused, I am also the person whose name was used in the vendor packet. The last thing either of us needs is me searching your business files and deciding what matters. I'm not asking you to steal anything. I know. I'm telling you why it still creates a mess. Dad leaned back, frustrated. Then what am I supposed to do? Get your own lawyer. Sterling has counsel, not Sterling's lawyer, yours. He looked at me as though I had suggested something extreme. You are not the company, I said. Courtney has interests. Sterling has interests. You have interests. They may overlap, but they are not automatically the same anymore. What do I tell the lawyer? The truth. That you were a paid part-time bookkeeper. That you prepared records. That you executed some instructions. That you questioned some things and still went along with others. Tell them what you actually did, not what you want your role to have been. Dad's expression tightened at the last sentence. And preserve everything, I continued. Do not delete emails. Do not clean up folders. Do not rename things to make them clearer. Do not call Courtney and agree on what happened. Do not ask Mom what she remembers and then merge your stories. Keep the files exactly as they are and let your lawyer decide what should go where. You sound like you've already decided I'm in trouble. I've decided you should stop making decisions based on which version is least painful today. He stared at me for several seconds. You really won't look at it? No, even if it proves Courtney told me what to do? Especially then. He looked hurt, and I understood why. Dad had come to me because I was the person in our family who organized messy things. Forms, bills, confusing letters, systems nobody wanted to read. He had taught me half those habits, and now he expected me to use them for him. But if I opened that laptop and started choosing evidence, I would become exactly what everyone had been trying to turn me into since October. The person responsible for making their consequences manageable. I'm not abandoning you, I said. I'm refusing to become your defense team. Dad nodded, but he did not look convinced. Mom called less than an hour after he left. I knew Dad had probably gone straight home, and I expected anger. What I did not expect was the coldness in her voice. Are you satisfied now? With what? You've turned your father against Courtney. I didn't know they were supposed to be on teams. Don't do that. Do what? Make everything sound clever. I moved the phone away from my ear for a second and took a slow breath. Dad asked me to look through Sterling records. I told him to get independent counsel. Exactly. That is what you're angry about? You are encouraging him to protect himself from his own daughter. I'm encouraging him to tell the truth about what he did. Courtney is his daughter too. That doesn't make him her liability shield. Mom's voice rose. Nobody called him that. You told him he can take responsibility because he is retired, and Courtney has her whole life ahead of her. There was silence. Dad had not exaggerated. Mom finally said, "Your father made the entries. And if he made a wrong entry, he should own it. He handled the books. He should own that too. He was the one moving payroll. On whose instructions?" Sarah, stop. No. That is the entire point. If Dad made a decision, it belongs to Dad. If Courtney made a decision, it belongs to Courtney. Why are you so desperate for one person to carry all of it? I am desperate for this family not to be destroyed. There it was again. Every time someone in my family faced the consequences of what they had done, Mom described the consequences as the thing destroying us. You told Dad he could take the hit, I said. He can survive this. The words were so blunt that I stopped pacing. Mom continued before I could answer. He is 64. He's mostly retired. He is not building a company. He is not trying to start a family. He is not newly married. His reputation is not his livelihood anymore. I felt something inside me go cold. You hear yourself, right? Don't judge me. I'm not judging you for being afraid. I'm listening to what you think fear gives you permission to do. Oh, please. You think Dad's future costs less because he has fewer working years left. Before that, you thought my reputation cost less because I didn't care about status. You keep deciding whose life is cheapest to spend. That is cruel. No, Mom. It is exactly what you just said. She went silent. I did not shout. I did not tell her she was a terrible mother. I did not need to. The argument was finally simple enough that volume would only make it less clear. I'm not going to turn Dad into an innocent man, I said. He is not one. He knew my name was in the packet. He helped send it. He followed instructions he should have challenged. If records prove that, he needs to accept it. Mom's voice softened slightly. Then why send him to his own attorney? Because telling the truth is not the same as volunteering to carry Courtney's share too. You always have to make this about fairness. Yes. She let out a bitter laugh. Life is not fair. No, but accounting can be accurate. Mom hung up on me. I sat in my kitchen afterward thinking about the word she had used. Survive. Dad could survive the hit. That was the family system stripped of all decoration. Consequences did not need to disappear. They only needed to land on the person everyone believed could absorb them without changing the structure around Courtney. A week later, Dad called from his attorney's office. He had taken my advice. Not perfectly and not immediately, but he had hired counsel who was separate from Sterling's business lawyer. His attorney had asked him to identify every place business communications might exist: current email, old folders, personal backups, accounting exports, archive drives. That was when Dad remembered the archive. He had always been obsessive about backup copies. When he started helping Sterling, he had set up an automatic archive of business email to an external encrypted drive and a cloud backup because he did not trust himself to remember what he had saved manually. It was the kind of habit that used to make Mom tease him. Dad saved tax records longer than anyone asked him to. He had receipts from appliances we no longer owned. He once produced an 8-year-old warranty document in under 3 minutes because he knew exactly which folder it lived in. Now the same habit frightened him. There are old threads, he told me. What kind? Vendor application material. September. Payroll scheduling. Operations questions. I did not ask him to send them. Instead I asked, "Does your lawyer know?" "Yes." "Good. I don't know what's in all of it." "Then don't start searching by yourself and forwarding random things. They're my emails. They may also be business records. Let your lawyer handle preservation and production." Dad was quiet. "There will be things that make me look bad. I assumed there would be. You don't have to sound so comfortable saying that." "I'm not comfortable. I'm trying not to lie to you," he sighed. "I asked questions, Sarah. I know. I didn't just blindly do everything. I know. I told Courtney sometimes that we were getting too close. And then? Sometimes I still did what she asked. That matters too. I know. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I felt the instinct to make it easier for him. I could have told him he had been manipulated. I could have said Courtney was the owner, so the responsibility was really hers. Both statements would have contained truth. Neither would have contained all of it. Dad, telling the truth now is the right thing, I said. It does not erase the choices you made then. I know. If the archive proves Courtney instructed you, that matters. Yes. If it proves you knew something was wrong and did it anyway, that matters too. Another pause. Yes. That was the first conversation we had had since the wedding, where Dad did not ask me, directly or indirectly, to reduce the cost of what he was admitting. 2 days later, he came to my townhouse again. This time, he did not bring the laptop. He told me his attorney had arranged for the archive to be preserved and reviewed through the appropriate channels. The outside process, looking at Sterling's records, would receive what counsel determined had to be produced. I would not get a copy simply because I was family. I told him that was exactly how it should be. Dad sat at my kitchen table with both hands around a cup of coffee he barely touched. There's one exchange I remember, he said. I looked at him. I remember it because I asked the question. From September? He nodded. I did not tell him to continue. If he wanted to tell me what he personally remembered writing, that was his choice. I was not going to ask him to open the archive or read from a document that had not yet gone through review. We were finishing the vendor packet, Dad said. Courtney wanted the compliance section done that night. She sent me your bio and some old material. My pulse quickened. But I kept my hands still on the table. I asked whether you had approved it. What did she say? I don't remember the exact first answer. Something about you helping before. Something about everyone knowing you had. That sounded like Courtney, Dad continued. I still didn't like it. So you asked again. He looked at me. I asked if I should send you the packet before we submitted it. The room seemed to quiet around us. And? Dad's face changed. Shame does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is just a person becoming unable to hold your eyes. She said no. That could mean a lot of things. I know. What do you remember? Dad swallowed. I remember the wording because it bothered me enough that I stared at it for a while. He finally looked up. She wrote, absolutely not. For months, every defense had depended on some version of misunderstanding. Courtney thought I would agree. Dad assumed I knew. Mom believed family help did not require formal permission. The vendor wording was broad. The old training material was real. Nothing had been forged. 2 words changed the shape of all of it. Absolutely not. If Dad remembered correctly, Courtney had not forgotten to ask me. She had made sure nobody did. By the first week of February, Dad's memory no longer mattered by itself. His attorney had preserved the archive. Sterling's outside review had received the material through the proper channels, and the email thread involving my name could finally be compared against the documents Courtney had submitted months earlier. I did not receive Dad's whole archive, and I never asked for it. What came to me was limited to the correspondence directly involving my name and whether I had consented to being represented as Sterling's advisor. That was enough. I had spent months listening to Courtney reduce the problem to interpretation, family help, loose language, and one sister being too rigid to understand how business worked. 4 short messages ended all of that. Dad forwarded the relevant thread to his attorney first. After counsel confirmed there was no reason he could not share the portion involving me with me, I received a PDF copy. The first message was from Courtney in September, while Sterling was preparing the preferred vendor packet. She had attached a shortened version of my professional biography and written, "Use Sarah's professional bio in the compliance section. It gives us credibility." There was no ambiguity in the verb. She did not say Dad had suggested it. She did not say a consultant had inserted it. She told him to use it. Dad replied, "Has she approved this?" Courtney answered that I had helped Sterling before, that the language was based on work I had already done, and that I was not going to object to something that benefited the company. It was exactly the argument I had heard since October, except now I could see that Courtney had been making it before I knew there was anything to object to. Dad had not stopped there. A later message read, "Should I send this to her before we submit?" Courtney's reply was 2 words. Absolutely not. I read them once, then again. I had expected anger. Instead, I felt something settle. For months, part of me had kept leaving room for incompetence. Maybe Courtney had believed an old favor gave her more permission than it did. Maybe Dad had misunderstood what she meant. Maybe everyone had been careless in a way that became serious, only because Sterling grew and nobody revisited the original assumption. Absolutely not. Remove that room. Dad had raised consent. Courtney had considered it. Then she had chosen secrecy. I called him that evening. I got the thread. I figured you would. Do you remember why you still sent the packet? Dad was silent for several seconds. Because she told me to. That is not really an answer. I know. Why did you follow the instruction? He exhaled slowly. Because by then I was already telling myself the same thing she was. You had helped. The wording was broad, but it wasn't invented out of nothing. We needed the application done. Sterling needed the account. And I thought if you ever found out, we could explain it. Latter. Yes. When the contract was already awarded, he did not answer. I looked at the PDF on my screen. You knew enough to ask me. I knew enough to ask Courtney whether you knew. And then you let the person benefiting from the answer decide whether I should be asked directly. Yes. It was the first time Dad had answered without decorating the truth. I was wrong, he said. Not because Courtney fooled me into pressing send. I knew I was uncomfortable. I pressed send anyway. That mattered to me more than an apology would have. He was not trying to become the innocent father who suddenly discovered his daughter was corrupt. He was admitting that his fear of losing Sterling had made him cooperate with something he knew deserved another question. Then keep telling it that way, I said. What do you mean? If someone asks what happened, don't say Courtney made you do it. Say what you just said. He was quiet. I knew I was uncomfortable. I did it anyway, I repeated. That doesn't exactly make me look good. It isn't supposed to. Dad gave a tired laugh. You really are my daughter. Unfortunately, for the first time in months, we both laughed, but the sound disappeared quickly. Then Dad said, "There's more." My stomach tightened. If it's worker case material, don't send it to me. I'm not sending anything. My attorney told me the outside review found messages that make Courtney's version of payroll harder to maintain. I did not ask to see them. What version? That I handled the books, and she relied on me. She did rely on you. Yes, but apparently there are direct instructions from her. I waited. Dad continued carefully. I have been told there is at least one message where she tells operations to move overtime into the next cycle and says they'll catch up after Harrington pays. I closed my eyes. Dad immediately added, I haven't seen how they're characterizing it legally. Good. Don't. I'm not. One message also doesn't establish everything that happened. I know, but it does establish she knew payroll was being moved. Yes. That was the important part. Courtney had told me cash flow was temporary. She had told me she needed 1 quarter. She had implied Dad handled the schedules and that if I wanted somebody to blame, I should talk to him. Now there was evidence that she had not merely been a founder receiving financial reports after the fact. She had participated in the timing decisions herself. I still did not know the full payroll pattern then. I did not see the underlying worker files, the pay records, or the internal communications being reviewed on Elena's side. I learned some of those details later, after settlement and restructuring discussions reached the point where factual outcomes could be summarized without pulling me into the case. What I eventually learned was that the outside process found recurring problems involving required prep time that had not been properly captured, overtime pushed beyond the normal payroll timing, and certain deductions that could not be supported the way Sterling had handled them. The review also found evidence supporting Elena's claim that her premium assignments declined after she kept raising pay concerns. At the time, however, all I knew was the narrow thing Dad was allowed to tell me. Courtney had directly participated in payroll timing decisions. That alone destroyed the clean scapegoat story she had started building around him. Courtney responded exactly the way I expected. She did not deny that Dad's archive existed. She changed what it meant. Dad called me after a meeting with his attorney and Sterling's counsel. He sounded more disgusted than angry. She says I was the accountant. You were the bookkeeper. She keeps calling me the accountant. You worked in accounting most of your career. That's why the label sounds believable. She said I should have known better. I waited. Dad gave a short, bitter laugh. The worst part is, she's right. About that part. Yes. You should have known better. I did know better. Also true. She's trying to make it sound like knowing better means I decided everything. That is not true. No. Then say both. Dad was quiet. You don't get to become innocent because Courtney is more responsible than she admits, I said. And she doesn't get to become innocent because you should have refused. I understand. Do you? I think I finally do. Dad told me Courtney's position had become that she was a founder, focused on clients, staffing, and growth while he handled the financial mechanics. She had trusted his experience. If payroll timing was mishandled, he should have flagged it more forcefully. If the vendor packet wording went too far, he should have known a professional biography needed approval. Every sentence contained a piece of truth. Together, they built a lie. Dad had financial experience. Dad had access. Dad had executed instructions. Dad had sent the packet. But Courtney had told him which bio to use. Courtney had been asked about my approval. Courtney had told him not to send the packet to me. Courtney had participated in payroll timing. And months later, when I offered her a clean correction, Courtney had tried to make me sign a retroactive statement instead. The chronology was becoming more damaging than any single document. September, use my bio. September, do not show me. October, vendor team asks me whether I am an advisor. October, I say no. November, Courtney asks me to create an ongoing relationship after the fact. November, I refuse in writing. December, Courtney asks for more time. January, Courtney begins pointing at Dad. February, the archive shows she had known from the beginning that I had not approved the use. Courtney's biggest mistake was no longer the original decision. It was everything she had done after she had been given the chance to correct it. That same week, Dad made a decision I did not know about until after he had already made it. He contacted Blake. He told me afterward because I asked why Courtney had suddenly started sending me messages about her marriage. I showed him the email thread, Dad said. I stared at him. Which thread? The one about your bio. Why? Because Courtney was telling him I had handled the packet and she had trusted me. I felt a flash of concern. Did you give him anything from the corporate review? No. Anything the outside team gave your lawyer? No, my own email thread, messages I sent and received. That distinction mattered. Blake remained recused from Sterling's corporate vendor review. Dad had not given him confidential payroll files, compliance findings, or procurement material. He had shown his son-in-law a family-side email conversation that Dad himself had participated in, because Courtney was now using Dad's role to explain what had happened inside their marriage. What did Blake say? Dad hesitated. You should probably ask him. I'm not calling my sister's husband to discuss their marriage. Then don't. I learned the rest in pieces. And I was careful even then not to pretend I had been in the room. Blake called me 2 days later. He did not tell me intimate details. He only wanted to make one thing clear because Courtney had begun accusing me of turning him against her. I saw the email your father was part of, he said. Not the vendor file. Not anything from the review. I know. I asked Courtney one question. I waited. Did she know you had not approved the use of your name when the packet was submitted? What did she say? That your father handled the packet. I looked down at my desk. Blake continued. So I asked again. And? She said everybody was treating normal business language like a crime. I did not say anything. He sounded tired rather than angry. I wasn't asking her whether the wording was criminal. I was asking whether she knew. That was the difference Courtney still refused to accept. Every time someone narrowed the question to a fact she could not survive, she widened the argument until she found somewhere safer to stand. Blake said, I'm staying out of Sterling's review. I'm not changing that. Good. But this part is not a vendor question anymore. I understood what he meant. It was a marriage question. Blake, whatever you decide about Courtney has to be about the two of you. It is. I don't want my name becoming the explanation for why your marriage works or doesn't. It isn't. There was a pause. Then he said, "We're staying separated." I did not ask whether that meant divorce. In North Carolina, separation and an absolute divorce were not the same thing. And it had only been weeks since they stopped living together. Blake said he was speaking with his own attorney about finances and the separation. That was all. I wished him well and ended the call. I did not feel satisfied. Courtney was my sister. Whatever else she had done, I had watched her stand in a wedding dress 4 months earlier and promised someone a life with her. Watching that marriage crack did not feel like winning. What happened next did. Not because she was hurting. Because for once, she came to my door and discovered I would not carry the pain for her. It was almost 9 on a Friday night when she knocked. I knew it was Courtney before I opened the door because she knocked the same way she did everything when she was angry. 3 sharp hits, a pause, then 2 more. I opened the door but did not invite her in. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot, and she looked as though she had not slept properly in days. "You turned Dad against me." I leaned against the doorframe. "No. He gave Blake private emails. That was Dad's decision, because you filled his head with this accountability garbage. Dad is 64. Don't. He can make his own choices. He was protecting me until you convinced him he was some kind of criminal." I never called him that. "You told him to get a lawyer." "Yes. You told him not to protect me. I told him not to lie about what he did." Courtney stepped closer. "Do you understand what you've done to this family?" There was a time that question would have pulled me into a long defense. I would have itemized every decision that was not mine and tried to prove I had not caused the disaster. I did not do that anymore. "You turned Dad against me," she repeated. "No," I said. "You tried to put him where you put me." Her expression changed. "What is that supposed to mean? Between you and the consequences." For once, Courtney had nothing ready. I continued. "When the vendor packet became a problem, I was supposed to sign something so the consequence landed on me. When payroll became a problem, Dad was supposed to say he handled it so the consequence landed on him. Every time something catches up with you, your first question is not, 'What did I do?' It's, 'Who can stand in front of this for me?' That is not fair. Neither was calling me your advisor. I said I would remove your name. If I signed, you could have signed 1 page, and then I would have become part of it." Her eyes filled, but the anger came first. "Blake moved out because of this. Blake moved out because of whatever happened between you and Blake. He saw those emails because Dad gave them to him. Dad gave him emails because you were telling Blake Dad handled the packet. I was explaining context. You were assigning blame. He did handle it. And you told him what to put in it?" Courtney folded her arms so tightly across her body that her shoulders rose. "Dad was an accountant for 30 years. If something was wrong with payroll, he should have stopped it." "Yes." She blinked. I think she expected me to defend him. "He should have stopped it," I repeated. "He should have refused instructions he knew were wrong. He should have refused to send my bio. He should have told me the truth months ago." Courtney stared at me. "Dad owns that," I said. "Now, you own yours. You want me to lose everything." "No. Don't, Lee. I wanted you to correct my name in October. Then November. Then again when you came here asking for time, you kept choosing something else. Because 100 people depend on that company. And that made you more responsible, not less. You have no idea what's going to happen if clients leave. I know workers could lose shifts. Mom and Dad could lose their money. I know. I could lose my house. I know you personally guaranteed part of the operating line and lease." She stared at me. "Dad really told you everything." "No, he told me enough to understand why you were scared. And it didn't matter." "It mattered. It just didn't make your version true." Courtney looked past me into my townhouse. "You always get to stand there clean." "No." "Yes, Sarah, you do. You didn't build anything. You didn't risk anything. You just wait for everyone else to make mistakes and then explain why you're better than them." That would have wounded me more a few months earlier. By then, I could hear the difference between a criticism I needed to learn from and a weapon she needed me to pick up. "I underestimated you for years," I said. "I thought the way you understood image and networking was shallow. I was wrong about that." Her expression shifted. "You're very good at understanding what people will believe," I continued. "The problem is you started believing that gave you the right to decide what they were allowed to know." Her face closed again. "You'll regret this," she said. "When Sterling collapses and people lose work, you will remember that you could have stopped it." "No. I will remember that I could have lied. You could have helped your sister." "I did." "When?" "6 years ago." She gave a bitter laugh. "And then again in November," I said. "How?" "I gave you a way to correct the use of my name without me humiliating you publicly. I told you I would not call clients, post about you, or turn the wedding into a spectacle. All you had to do was tell the truth about the part involving me and cooperate with the people handling everything else." "You call that help?" "Yes. You offered me surrender. I offered you a smaller consequence before you created a larger one." Courtney's eyes narrowed. "You think this is over?" "No." That answer surprised her. I did not think it was over. Sterling still had workers. Dad and Mom still had money invested. Courtney still had personal guarantees. Outside review was still underway. The fact that Courtney had been caught lying did not automatically produce the clean ending people imagine when they hear the word evidence. But one thing was over. I was done trying to persuade her. "If you came here because you want me to change what I said about my professional relationship with Sterling, the answer is no. What if I came because I needed my sister? Then don't ask your sister to lie." She stared at me. I stepped back. Courtney said, "You're really going to close the door in my face?" "I'm going to close my door because this conversation is finished." "You're unbelievable." "I know." I closed it. My hands shook afterward. I was not made of stone, and boundaries do not become easy simply because they are correct. I stood in my hallway listening to her footsteps cross the porch, then the sound of her car starting outside. I wanted to feel powerful. Mostly, I felt tired. The next morning, an email arrived from the outside contact, handling the narrow issue involving my name. It did not give me payroll records or privileged details. It simply confirmed that my correction had been accepted into the record, and that Sterling could no longer represent me as a current compliance advisor. Near the bottom was another factual update. Several major clients had paused new Sterling assignments while the broader review continued. Because of the company's liquidity pressure and unresolved worker obligations, advisors were beginning to evaluate restructuring options, including the possible sale of selected operating assets to another staffing operator. I read that paragraph twice. If Sterling simply collapsed, Courtney would suffer. So would people who had done nothing wrong. Workers could lose shifts before they received money already owed. Clients could walk away. My parents' equity could disappear. Courtney's guarantees could come due against a business with fewer assets left to satisfy anything. For months, everyone had told me the only two choices were saving Courtney or destroying Sterling. Now, a third possibility was taking shape. Sterling's work might survive. Its employees might survive. Its client relationships might survive. The question was whether Courtney could survive the one condition that possibility was beginning to require. The company might have to continue without her. Linda called me on a Sunday afternoon and said she wanted one last conversation before everyone's lawyers turned this family into permanent enemies. I almost refused. By then, every invitation to talk had turned into some version of the same request. Change one fact, soften one sentence, absorb one consequence. But Mom said Dad would be there, Courtney would be there, and nobody intended to discuss Elena's case or ask me for information from the clinic. She said they wanted to settle the family part before Sterling's counsel and the outside advisors locked their positions around the restructuring. I told her I would come under one condition. If there is a document waiting for me, I will read it. I am not signing anything in your house. Mom sighed, as if I were the difficult one. But she agreed. Dad opened the door when I arrived. He looked exhausted but steadier than he had in January. Courtney was already sitting at the dining table with a folder in front of her. Mom had made coffee, nobody was drinking. The room looked almost exactly like the place where I had helped Courtney with her first employee handbook years earlier, and the symmetry would have been funny if it had not made me so angry. Courtney pushed the folder toward the empty chair across from her. Read it before you decide it's evil. I sat down and opened it. The statement was only 2 pages long. It described Sterling's problems as a series of misunderstandings created during rapid growth. According to the draft, I had provided informal workforce guidance during Sterling's development. Dad had handled bookkeeping administration and certain payroll processing decisions. Courtney, as founder, had relied in good faith on both of us while focusing on operations, client. The language did not say I currently served as an advisor. It did something smarter. It blurred 6 years into one continuous relationship and arranged Dad's real responsibilities so that Courtney appeared to be standing in the middle of 2 people who had failed her. I finished reading and placed the pages back on the table. No. Mom closed her eyes. Sarah, I said I would read it. Courtney leaned forward. Which part is false? The structure. That isn't an answer. It turns separate facts into one story. I helped you in 2019. Dad handled bookkeeping later. Those things are true. The conclusion that you relied on both of us in good faith while mistakes happened around you is not something I can confirm. Courtney's mouth tightened. You don't know what I relied on. Exactly. So I'm not signing a document that claims I do. Dad said nothing. Courtney tapped the page with one fingernail. Your section is accurate. You gave me workforce guidance for a 7-person company 6 years ago. It says during development. That phrase covers 6 years if somebody wants it to. You always do this. Read words? Make normal language sound sinister. I looked at Dad. Did your lawyer review this? He hesitated. Sterling's counsel prepared the first version. That was not my question. My lawyer told me not to sign it as written. Courtney turned on him. Because your lawyer only cares about protecting you. That is what lawyers generally do for their clients, I said. Stay out of it. I stared at her. You invited me here. Mom stepped between us, verbally, before either of us raised our voices. No one is asking anybody to take all the blame. The purpose is to show that mistakes were made by several people. And Courtney did not wake up one morning planning any of this. Then write that without using my name. We need your part clarified. My part is already clarified. Not in a way that helps. The honesty of Mom's sentence quieted the room. Courtney looked at her, then back at me. Do you know what happens if this restructuring goes badly? I know enough. No, you don't. You get notices about your precious name. You don't see the debt. You don't see clients hesitating. You don't see workers asking whether they'll still have shifts next month. I also don't see the confidential records because I am not supposed to. That's convenient. It is deliberate. She gave a short laugh and pushed her chair back. You get to protect yourself from everything and call it ethics. I protected myself from one thing, being used as your advisor. You have no idea what your reputation is worth to you compared to what Sterling is worth to me. The sentence came so quickly I knew she had not planned it. I waited. Courtney stood and began pacing behind her chair. You work at a nonprofit, Sarah. You are not building a brand. You are not raising capital. You are not signing leases. You are not responsible for 100 people getting work. If someone thinks you gave your sister advice once, what does that actually cost you? Dad looked down. Mom whispered Courtney's name like a warning, but my sister was past listening. I built something, she said. Something real. Something that employs people. Something Mom and Dad invested in. Something Blake respected before you turned one line in a packet into proof that I'm some kind of fraud. And you're willing to let all of that burn because you need everyone to understand exactly how important your name is. There it was. The wedding suddenly made sense in a way it had not before. When Courtney called me nobody, she had not simply been insulting my career. She had been expressing the value system she had been operating under for years. My reputation mattered when she could borrow it. My consent mattered less because, in her mind, I did not use reputation for anything important. I worked at a nonprofit. I did not chase status. I did not leverage my name for contracts. Therefore, to Courtney, my credibility was an idle asset, something she could spend because I was not spending it myself. You really believe that? I said. She folded her arms. Believe what? That because I don't monetize my reputation the way you do, you needed it more. Courtney's face changed. You think Sterling had a higher use for my name than I did. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you said. Mom shook her head. Sarah, don't twist. I'm not twisting anything. Courtney just explained why she thought this was harmless. Courtney's eyes narrowed. You want an apology? Fine. I should have asked. I should have sent you the packet. I should have done 100 things differently. Is that enough? No. Of course not. Because you're still asking me to sign the same idea in cleaner language. She stared at me. I pushed the statement back toward her. You did not misunderstand my role. Dad asked whether I approved it. Then he asked whether he should send it to me. Mom's lips parted, but no sound came out. Courtney turned toward Dad. You showed her? Dad lifted his head. The thread involving her name was mine to share after I checked with my attorney. You had no right. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed. Dad did not. He reached into a folder beside his chair and removed a printed email thread. Linda hasn't seen it. Mom looked at him. Seen what? Dad slid the pages across the table. Mom picked them up reluctantly. I watched her eyes move down the first message. Courtney, use Sarah's professional bio. It gives us credibility. Dad. Has she approved this? Courtney's explanation that I had helped before. Then Dad's second question. Should I send this to her before we submit? Mom stopped. She read the reply. Absolutely not. For months, my mother had defended Courtney with variations of the same sentence. She thought you knew. She assumed you would agree. She believed family helped family. Now the question of whether I knew had been written down before the packet was submitted, and Courtney had answered it herself. Mom lowered the page. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Courtney recovered first. That was because we were under a deadline. Dad looked at her. You know we were, she continued. We were trying to finish that section before submission. Sarah takes 3 days to answer an email when she's busy. So you knew she had not approved it, Dad said. I knew she hadn't seen that version. That is what approval means. Courtney stared at him. Do not suddenly act like you objected. You sent it. Yes. You formatted it. Yes. You helped me submit it. Yes. You moved payroll when it needed to be moved. Dad's face changed, but he did not interrupt. Courtney pointed at him. You were the accountant in the room, Dad. You knew the numbers. You knew the cash position. You prepared the schedules. If something was wrong, why didn't you stop it? Mom looked from one of them to the other. There it was again, the transfer. Courtney had run out of room to put the problem on me, so she was pushing it toward Dad. He sat very still. You're right, he said. Courtney blinked. I should have stopped more than I did. I should not have sent Sarah's bio. I should not have moved entries just because you told me cash would catch up. I knew enough to ask questions and then accepted answers I wanted to believe. Courtney's expression softened with relief. Then say that in the statement. Dad shook his head. Her face hardened again. I will say what I did, he said. I will not say I independently made decisions you instructed me to carry out. No one is asking you to. The document does. It says I relied on you. You did. And I relied on you when you told me things were temporary. Both are true. Courtney pushed the statement toward him. Then we can fix the wording. Dad did not touch it. His voice was quiet when he spoke. I lied for you. Mom inhaled. Courtney stared at him. Dad continued. Not by inventing everything. That would almost be easier. I lied by omission. I formatted things I knew should have been questioned. I executed instructions and told myself they would be corrected later. I let Sarah's name go through because I was afraid asking her would slow down an application we needed. I helped you. Courtney's jaw tightened. Exactly. No. Dad looked directly at her. I lied for you. I will not lie as you. Courtney went pale. Dad placed both palms on the table. If I lose the money your mother and I invested, that is part of our risk. If I owe legal fees because of what I did, I will pay them. If somebody reviewing my actions says I crossed a line, I will answer for the line I crossed. But I am not going to sign a document that turns me into the person who decided everything so you can become the founder who trusted the wrong bookkeeper. Courtney stood so abruptly her chair struck the wall. Mom did not defend her. She was still holding the email. Courtney looked at me. You did this. No. You turned him against me. You said that before. Because it's true. Dad started to speak, but I lifted my hand slightly. No, I said. You tried to put him where you put me. Her eyes flashed. Don't start with that speech again. It isn't a speech. When your vendor packet became a problem, I was supposed to stand between you and the consequence by signing a clarification. When payroll became a problem, Dad was supposed to stand between you and the consequence by becoming the person who made the decisions. You think Dad has no responsibility? He has responsibility. Dad looked at me. So does Mom, I continued. She pressured both of us because she was afraid of losing the investment and afraid of what Sterling failing would mean for you. Mom flinched. I have responsibility too. I underestimated how strategic Courtney could be because I dismissed things like image and status as shallow. I helped her once, and then assumed an old boundary would protect itself forever. I was wrong about that. Courtney gave a bitter laugh. How noble. But none of those things make your choices ours. The room went quiet again. I looked at Dad. You own what you did. He nodded. I looked at Mom. You own what you pressured people to do. She did not nod, but she stopped arguing. Then I looked at Courtney. And I am not taking anything that belongs to you. Her face twisted. You already have. No. That is the part you still don't understand. Someone else refusing to carry your consequence is not stealing from you. I stood and picked up my coat. Mom finally spoke. Where are you going? Home. We haven't decided anything. I have. Courtney laughed sharply. Of course. Sarah gets to walk away while everybody else deals with the actual disaster. I slipped my arms into my coat. I dealt with my part months ago. I told the truth about my name. You could still help save Sterling. If Sterling can only be saved by rewriting who made which decisions, then you are not saving Sterling. You are saving yourself inside Sterling. That stopped her. Not because she agreed. Because she understood. I left without another argument. 3 days later, Dad called me. He did not give me privileged documents or forward Sterling's restructuring materials. He told me only what his own counsel had explained to him as a minority investor and as someone whose conduct was part of the review. A successor staffing operator had made a conditional asset purchase proposal. They aren't buying the company as is, Dad said. What are they buying? Selected assets. The scheduling platform. Client relationships they can preserve. Equipment. Some operational material. They want to make offers to most of the workers they can keep. Contracts? Only where clients consent or sign new agreements. Nothing transfers automatically. That sounded more realistic than the rescue stories people like to tell after businesses failed, where someone bought a company Friday and every employee woke up Monday under a new logo with nothing else changed. What happens to worker obligations? The restructuring and settlement process prioritizes approved wage obligations and other higher priority claims before equity holders see much. So you and Mom lose most of the $120,000. Yes. Dad said it without drama. And Courtney? She loses control. I sat down. The operator does not want her in management. Dad continued. They think too much client confidence is tied to removing the governance problem. That phrase was clinical. The consequence was not. Sterling could survive in pieces. Many workers might keep getting shifts. Client relationships might be preserved where the clients agreed. The scheduling systems Courtney had built could continue being used. But the future would not have her at the center of it. What does Courtney say? I asked. Dad was quiet for a moment. She has not accepted. I was not surprised. He continued. Her lawyer explained the alternatives. If the buyer walks, the paused accounts may stay paused. Cash gets worse. The company has less ability to meet the worker obligations and other claims. The personal guarantees become more painful if asset value keeps dropping. And she still hasn't said yes. No. Why? You know why. I did. For months, Courtney had insisted every questionable decision was about saving jobs, protecting Sterling, preserving what she had built. Now someone had offered a version of that outcome. The work could survive. Many employees could survive. Parts of the business could survive. Only Courtney's position would not. Dad told me about the final question she had asked during the call with her counsel. He had been present because the proposal affected his and Mom's minority equity. He repeated it carefully, making clear he was telling me what he personally heard. Courtney had asked, "And if I say no?" The answer had been simple. The buyer could walk, major clients could remain paused. Sterling's cash position would continue deteriorating, and the chances of workers receiving everything they were owed would get worse. For the first time since this began, Courtney was being offered exactly what she said she had been fighting to protect. The company without her, the workers before her. All she had to do was decide which one she had really been trying to save. Courtney held out for 6 more days before accepting the restructuring offer. I knew that because Dad called me after her counsel had notified the minority investors that the deal was moving forward. By then, there was no dramatic boardroom showdown left to have. No one was waiting for me to press a button or expose one final secret. Sterling had reached the point where numbers were doing what arguments had failed to do. Major accounts had paused new assignments. The preferred vendor opportunity was effectively gone. Worker claims were being negotiated, and every week of uncertainty made the company less valuable to the operator willing to preserve pieces of it. Courtney could either accept a deal that removed her from management or keep control over a company that was becoming less capable of meeting the obligations she kept, insisting she wanted to protect. Dad sounded tired when he told me. She signed everything, the restructuring agreement, the asset sale pieces that needed her approval. There are still client consents and separate documents to finish. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear and looked at the same window where I had stood months earlier, while Courtney asked me for 1/4 of silence. "And she's out? Once closing finishes, yes, no management role." Dad paused before adding, "They offered a short transition period for administrative handoff. No client authority, no payroll authority, no title that lets her represent herself as running the new operation." That detail mattered more than whether the Sterling name survived. Courtney had spent 6 years making herself and the company almost interchangeable. Sterling was proof that she mattered. Sterling was why Mom introduced her as our entrepreneur. Sterling was why Courtney believed my reputation was something she could borrow because hers was attached to something larger. Now the scheduling systems she built, the client relationships that could be preserved, and many of the jobs created under her company might continue without her at the center. The deal did not happen in one afternoon. March and April were mostly negotiation. Some clients chose not to continue at all. Others agreed to new arrangements with the successor operator after reviewing the transition. A few required new contracts because their existing agreements could not simply be handed to another company. Workers received new offers rather than waking up one morning magically employed by someone else. There were people who left, people who found other jobs, and people who stayed because banquet staffing was still the work they knew and the venues still needed them. By late May, enough pieces had closed that Sterling, as Courtney had known, it was effectively finished. Mom and Dad's equity was almost worthless. The $120,000 they had put in over several years had bought minority ownership, not a guaranteed repayment. After the claims, debt, professional fees, and shrinking asset value were accounted for, there was very little left for them. They did not lose their house. They did not become poor overnight. Dad still had retirement income. They still had the savings they had not invested. But the loss was real, and it changed things they had assumed they would do later. Mom postponed a kitchen renovation she had talked about for years. Dad became more careful about travel. They had less financial flexibility because they had made a risky investment and then spent too long protecting the story that it was still a success. For once, neither of them asked me to replace what they lost. The worker payments took longer. I did not participate in those negotiations. I never saw the calculation sheets while the matter was active. And I did not ask Marcus or anyone at the clinic for updates. By then, staying out had stopped feeling passive. It felt like one of the clearest decisions I had made. The people affected by Sterling's pay practices, deserved outcomes determined by their records and their advocates, not by what Courtney's older sister thought would make the ending satisfying. The first back pay and settlement payments began going out in early summer. They were not giant checks delivered under television cameras. Some amounts were paid according to agreed schedules, because the restructured business and remaining assets could not make everyone whole in one day. The outcome addressed unpaid or improperly delayed compensation that the review supported, along with other claims that survived scrutiny. Some things workers had complained about were not treated as violations simply because someone disliked them. Others were supported by time records, messages, payroll history, and the way Sterling had actually operated. Elena contacted me in June, after the part of her matter involving my clinic had reached a point where she was free to decide what she wanted to share personally. She asked if I had time for coffee. I checked with my supervisor before agreeing because, after everything that had happened, I had no interest in assuming the conflict had disappeared just because months had passed. Once I knew the active representation issue no longer made the meeting inappropriate, Elena and I met at a small cafe not far from the clinic. She looked different from the woman who had sat across from me the previous October. Not transformed, not suddenly carefree, just lighter. I got the first payment, she told me. I'm glad. They're doing the rest on schedule. She stirred her coffee for a moment. There was something else. I waited. They confirmed the hotels never blacklisted me. That mattered to her more than I expected. For months, Elena had believed she might have lost premium assignments because clients no longer wanted her. That was what she had been told. She had questioned whether she had become difficult, whether managers considered her unreliable, whether 3 years of good work had somehow stopped mattering. According to the resolution she chose to describe to me, the reduction in her premium shifts had come from inside Sterling after she kept raising pay concerns. It was not a hotel calling and saying Elena Ruiz should never come back. She laughed softly and shook her head. I spent almost a year thinking I had done something wrong. You asked about your pay. I know that now. She had accepted an offer with the successor operator, not because I asked anyone to hire her. I never made a call on her behalf. The people who had worked with her knew she was good at banquet operations, and she had experience training new staff. She earned the offer by being useful long before anyone knew her name would matter to this story. Before we left, Elena looked at me and said, "When I first came to the clinic, I thought your name meant they had checked everything. I know. I was mad at you for about 5 minutes. That's fair," she smiled. Then you walked out of the room. I understood what she meant. The thing that ultimately made my name trustworthy was not that it could make a company look good. It was that I had been willing to remove it from a process where it did not belong. Courtney's financial consequences became clearer around the same time. The company's problems did not automatically become her personal debts simply because she owned Sterling. But years earlier, when she expanded, she had personally guaranteed part of the revolving operating line and part of the commercial lease. Dad had warned me about that in December, back when everyone still thought a Harrington contract might give Courtney enough breathing room to repair everything quietly. Now those guarantees mattered. Courtney was not thrown onto the street. She did not go from a luxury wedding to sleeping in her car. Reality was less theatrical and, in some ways, crueler. She lost the founder salary that had supported much of the identity she had built. She used savings to resolve part of her personal exposure. She sold a few non-essential assets and cut expenses sharply. People in the hospitality network who once called her directly began dealing with the successor operator instead. Some professional relationships survived socially, but the phrase, "call Courtney at Sterling," stopped meaning what it once had. The company had been her introduction. Then it belonged to somebody else. Blake and Courtney remained separated. They had begun living apart in January. By August, 7 months had passed, and both of them had attorneys handling financial separation and the practical pieces of dismantling a marriage that had barely begun. They had no children, so there was no custody fight to turn into another battlefield. Under North Carolina's timeline, they had not been separated long enough for the absolute divorce Courtney sometimes spoke about as though it had already happened. As of the time I am telling this, they are still legally married. Their marriage, however, has been over in every daily sense for months. Blake and I spoke only once after the restructuring closed. He called because he wanted to tell me something that had nothing to do with Courtney's corporate review. "You remember that meeting in 2023? He asked. I remember wishing it would end 3 hours earlier. He laughed. "I remember thinking you were irritating. That sounds more accurate than honor to see you again. You were irritating because you kept saying the dashboard wasn't the workers." I leaned back in my chair. He continued. "We had reports telling us the vendor relationship looked manageable. You kept asking what the reports weren't capturing. And I learned the lesson professionally. Apparently I didn't learn it personally. I knew what he meant, but I did not turn the conversation into an analysis of Courtney. People are not dashboards either." "No." He was quiet before adding, "I should have asked harder questions sooner." "Maybe." There was no flirtation in it. No secret suggestion that the decent CEO would now choose the decent older sister. Blake had married Courtney because he loved something in her. That relationship failed because of what happened between them, not because another woman was waiting at the end of the story. He told me he intended to continue the separation and follow his attorney's advice about filing when he was legally eligible if nothing changed. I wished him well. Then we went back to our separate lives. Dad changed more slowly than I expected, which made the change easier to trust. He stopped doing bookkeeping work entirely. He paid his own legal fees related to his involvement and accepted that losing most of his sterling equity was not something anyone owed him compensation for. He never claimed the archive turned him into a hero. When we talked about what happened, he did not say, "Courtney made me." He said, "I knew enough to question it and still did it." That sentence became the closest thing we had to rebuilding. Mom struggled more. She had spent years organizing our family around the belief that Courtney was the successful daughter, and I was the difficult one who did not understand what success looked like. Once Sterling was gone from Courtney's control, Mom did not know what story to replace it with. In July, she called me and said, "Your sister has lost everything." I was standing in a grocery store parking lot with 2 bags in one hand. "No, she hasn't. You know what I mean. I know what happened. She lost her company. Blake left. She's had to sell things. People talk. I'm sure that hurts." Mom was silent for a moment. "You should call her." "Why?" "Because she's your sister." I almost smiled at how familiar the answer was. "Being my sister is why I'm not trying to hurt her," I said. "It doesn't mean she gets access to me whenever consequences become lonely. Sarah, she has no one." "That isn't true. She needs family." "Then be her family." Mom did not like that answer because she wanted forgiveness to be something I supplied on behalf of everyone. I had stopped doing that. "She lost so much," Mom said. "Yes. Doesn't that matter to you?" "It matters. It does not undo what happened." Mom eventually ended the call without getting what she wanted. I did not feel victorious. I simply did not feel guilty enough to change my answer. Courtney called me herself 3 weeks later. It was the first time we had spoken directly since the meeting at our parents' house. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Then I answered because I knew I did not need to be afraid of the conversation anymore. Her voice was flat. "The transition is done." I heard. "Of course you did. Dad told me the deal closed." She gave a short laugh. "Everyone keeps you informed." "Not everyone." There was a pause. Then she said, "You got what you wanted." I looked at my desk. On one side was a stack of intake notes from cases that had nothing to do with Sterling. On the other was my coffee, already cold. "No," I said. "Everyone kept what they earned." "So did you." "What is that supposed to mean?" "The workers kept the money they earned. Dad kept the responsibility for what he did. Mom and Dad kept the risk they chose when they invested. I kept my name. You kept the consequences of your decisions. You make everything sound so clean." It wasn't clean. I lost my company. You lost control of it. Same thing. That may be the problem. Her breathing changed. "You still don't get it," she said. "If you had signed 1 page in November, we could have bought enough time. Harrington might have come through. Receivables would have cleared. I could have fixed payroll. Dad wouldn't have panicked. Blake wouldn't have seen those emails. I closed my eyes. 10 months had passed since the wedding, and Courtney was still describing the same fantasy. One more page, one more contract, one more quarter. Then everything would have been fixed before anyone needed to know. You still think the problem was that time ran out, I said. It was. No. The problem was that every time ran out, you spent somebody else to buy more. That is such a Sarah sentence. Probably. You could have saved me. I thought about Elena believing hotels had rejected her. Dad being told his retirement made his reputation cheaper. Mom asking me to sign because my name did not matter as much as Courtney's business. Blake learning that the woman he married could look directly at evidence and still widen the story until she found somewhere to hide. Then I thought about a dining table in 2019, when I had helped my little sister because she was excited and I loved her. That afternoon had been real too. Courtney had not been born into this ending. She built it one temporary exception at a time. You spent my name for years, I said. The account is closed. She was quiet. I did not wait for an apology. I hope you figure out what comes next, I told her. But I'm not going to be what comes next for you. Then I ended the call. That was several weeks ago. It is August now, and my life looks remarkably similar to the life Courtney once dismissed as insignificant. I still live in the same townhouse. I still work at the same nonprofit clinic. I did not receive money from Sterling's sale. I did not receive anything from the workers' settlement. I did not get my sister's husband, her clients, her house, or her place in some social circle I never wanted. I go to work. I listen. I document. I go home. The difference is that I no longer believe ignoring image makes me immune to what other people do with mine. For years, I thought boundaries were mostly about saying no when someone asked for something. Courtney taught me the harder version. Sometimes nobody asks. Sometimes they take an old yes and stretch it across 6 years. Sometimes they turn your silence into permission, your competence into endorsement, and your loyalty into an asset they assume they can spend. When that happens, being above the drama is not enough. You correct the record. You say exactly what you agreed to and exactly what you did not. Then you let everyone else keep the consequences that belong to them. This morning, before I left the office, an email arrived asking me to confirm my title for a community training next month. The organizer had written, Sarah Mitchell, Director of Worker Intake and Advocacy, followed by a short description of what I actually do. I read it once. Everything was correct. I typed, confirmed, thank you, closed my laptop, and walked out into the August heat. For most of my life, I thought there was strength in not caring whether anyone considered me somebody. I still do. I just know now that my name has value even when I never use it to impress a room. And no one in my family gets to decide what that value is for me. You cannot control what family members choose to do, but you can control what you allow them to do with your name, your work, and your trust. Never sign something false just to keep the peace, and never let guilt turn someone else's consequences into your responsibility. Protect your reputation with clear boundaries, written records, and honest answers, even when the truth costs people you love. Helping family does not mean giving them permanent permission to use you. If this story reminded you to protect what you've earned, subscribe to the channel for more family stories about truth, accountability, and consequences.